Okay, so okay. I don't even know if I'm live right now. Okay, seems like I am live. I hope someone could hear me. If only there was anyone to tell me if the audio was okay. If anyone could hear me correct, fine or something. Yeah. So, anyways, I don't see anyone. Well, that's okay. I'll just begin doing this. Okay. So this is my reaction and sort of response, I guess, to a to a video series that I saw from a channel called Midwestern Marx. So apparently they're Marxist-Leninists, if I understand correctly. Yeah, and they have this person called Kayla Popuche, okay, who is going to try and quote-unquote debunk Ukrainian nationalism, even though there's like variations of Ukrainian nationalism, like it's not just one monolith. There's yeah, there's obviously like third position Ukrainian nationalism. There's also left-wing Ukrainian nationalism, such as such as myself. There's your typical like normal right-wing Ukrainian nationalism, or yeah, more centrist Ukrainian nationalism, liberal Ukrainian nationalism. There's economic Ukrainian nationalism, whatever we think of economic nationalism, if it is real nationalism or not, that's up to you. So yeah, anyways, without further ado, let's begin.
Ukrainian Nazis. So there's a lot of talk about Ukrainian Nazis.
Okay, so Ukrainian Nazis. Okay, so you're responding to third position Ukrainian nationalists, as what I'm understanding.
Azov Battalion, and other groups of their ilk, considering Russia's special operation in Donbass and Ukrainian-controlled territory.
Special operation. What do you mean? You mean when they came with troops in 2014, which Putin even admitted himself? But anywho, I mean, we'll talk about that later. Right?
This is a series that will study and debunk Ukrainian nationalist propaganda that is all around us today. Many people say that Ukraine is not a Nazi state because they have a Jewish president and because Ukrainian Jews have said that anti-
Hold on. You're not debunking Ukrainian nationalism. You're attacking one specific branch of Ukrainian nationalism. So what you're attacking basically is like more of the pravi sector, sort of like a national corpus guys who kind of subscribe to like a third position aesthetic, wherever or not the ideology is actually third position is how to say, is more or less debatable, because a lot of it is basically just a lot of like white nationalist talking points, which a lot of fascists do not want to support, because basically they view like Wignats as more of like race-obsessed liberals. They don't really support any form of alternative. They want to keep like the same system as we have like in place without really changing. Just make it nicer for basically like European people. That's basically what they support. They also support like more of like a pan-European position, which certain, it depends to who you talk to, but certain nationalists don't really support a pan-European position, because pan-Europeanism is, well, a form of internationalism. Let's be blunt. So you're only responding to like one specific variation of Ukrainian nationalism. You're not debunking like the entire movement. Um, yeah, you're not debunking like the entire Ukrainian nationalist movement, which is like a variety of ideologies. But come on.
Anti-Semitism in Ukraine is just a Russian propaganda trope. Well,
I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't any like anti-Semites in Ukraine, but anti-Semitism in Ukraine, I mean, if you look at like percentage stat, it's one of the lowest in Eastern Europe, like genuinely. Why, I can't tell you why, but it's apparently one of the lowest percentages in Eastern Europe. Yeah, Ukraine has like the lowest percentage of anti-Semitism in Europe. I'm not saying that there aren't any anti-Semites in Ukraine. There are, but it's not like a majority vast. It's not a majority vast movement either. It's not like a massive phenomenon either.
Well, let's talk about Nazism in Ukraine. First, I want to talk about Kievan Rus and the mythology around the first Ukrainian state.
I mean, oh man, to say that to say that like nationalists view Kiev and Rus as the first Ukrainian state is kind of disingenuous. Say that they're inheritors of Kiev and Rus is more of like, I would say, an argument. That's mainly because of like the first Ukrainian state being the Kingdom of Galicia Volhynia, and having the Principality of Kiev, basically like uniting, or at least like, yeah, or at least joining the Kingdom of Galicia Volhynia in order to defend themselves against Andrei Bogolubsky's raid on Kiev. So Andrei Bogolubsky, for those who don't know, was the first prince of Vladimir Suzdal, which could be seen as basically like the first authentic Russian state, if you want. So yeah, basically Andrei Bogolubsky was someone who was a bit petty against like against Kiev, also because, to put it into context, basically the Kievan Rus at that point doesn't exist. It fell because of like various internal rivalries. Obviously, the Mongol invasion didn't help. However, even if there was the Mongol invasion, the principality at that point, the principality of Rus, was basically like falling apart anyways, due to these various like rivalries between principalities. But to say that like the Kievan Rus is seen as the first Ukrainian state, that's kind of like that's kind of pushing the barrel. I mean, maybe some esoteric like nationalists do view like Kievan Rus as like all genuinely like the first Ukrainian state, but that's like a minority. I'd say that most like nationalists view Ukraine as like the inheritors of Kievan Rus, mainly because of that reattachment of the Principality of Kiev to the Kingdom of Galicia Volhynia. Kingdom of Galicia Volhynia, once again, could be seen as the first like manifestation of the Ukrainian state.
Kievan Rus was a kingdom that existed in the now Eastern Europe from the 9th century to the 13th century. Its capital was Kiev, ruled by the Rurik dynasty. Kievan Rus was a multi-ethnic kingdom founded by,
I mean, maybe in the very beginning a multi-ethnic kingdom, but afterwards you would have like you would have like intermarriages between like these various ethnicities, which would give rise to like to, I guess, what today could be called like authentically what is the Slavs of today, right? So I mean, yeah, multi-ethnic in the sense of what you had like Kumans also who were living like in certain patches, because you had like some Kuman encroachments within the Kievan Rus. I mean, this is kind of like an abstract term here. Like, what do you mean by multi-ethnic?
by Nordic nomads and Eastern Slavic tribes, later creating what is called the Ruthenian people. The kingdom was actually never called Kievan Rus until the 19th century.
So yeah, as I said, so in the very beginning, yes, indeed, you had like Viking explorers, which basically came to what is now, to what was Kievan, to what was those lands, these eastern lands. It basically kind of established like like what would become Rus. However, Kiev as a city already existed. It was made by like it was even like other places like Novgorod and so on were already cities like that were created by the local people before the Nordic traders came.
Century. Until then, it was known as Rus, the land of Ruthenian people. The northern principalities of Kievan Rus, or lands that are now today Russia and Belarus, while the southern principalities are today now part of Ukraine. Ukrainian nationalists will claim that this is the first Ukrainian state.
Again, I explained like maybe esoteric, like these hyper esoteric people might call like Kievan Rus the first Ukrainian state. But I would say that more people view themselves, view it as more like the inheritors of Kievan Rus. That's mainly because of the Principality of Kiev, again, reattaching itself to Galicia Volhynia.
Because it was ruled out of Kiev. But this is a kingdom that predates even the concept of Ukraine. Because Ukraine as a term literally translates to borderlands.
My favorite propaganda talking point. No, it does not translate to borderland. Like Ukraine means on the land. It's more on the, it's in the land or on the land. It's not borderland. I don't know where you get this idea from.
Borderlands of what? The Russian Empire, which only existed.
The Russian Empire? You mean the Russian Empire that formed itself after the Great Nordic War? That's interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, Ukraine is sort of a concept. I mean, there were already talks of like the idea of Ukraine as a state. I mean, the regional period, the geographical location was already being called Ukraine even in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So, say that the borderlands of the Russian Empire, not really. And even when it came to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that's not even that like it's not even that. So I mean, I don't know. I don't know where this comes from.
Did well after the demise of Kievan Rus. Likewise, would we call the Grand Duchy of Lithuania the first Belarusian state because its once capital Novogrudok is now a Belarusian city?
Unironically, I know certain like esoteric Belarusian nationalists who do call like Lithuania as basically like a part as an extension of Belarus, but again, that's like a minority.
No, because the Grand Duchy of Lithuania predates the concept of Belarus. So when Zelensky...
I mean, there's also, well, I mean, I'll be a Belarusian nationalist for 2 seconds. It's also because a lot of the rulers within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, there were a lot of Belarusian, Ruthenian, noblemen who had like seats of power and who did have like some control of the administration within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But I digress. I mean, this is not a video on Belarus.
Or other pro-Ukrainian voices say that Kievan Rus belongs to Ukraine only. Just understand that it's a myth of half-truths. And
yeah, and again, you're grabbing straws here because you're focusing on like a small fringe minority who believe this.
They're not telling the full story because they want to portray Ukrainian history as completely distinct from Russian history. Because unfortunately for them,
well, after the fall of Kievan Rus, yeah, when the Kingdom of Galicia Volhynia started creating itself, yeah, it had its distinct development. It had like a separate development at that point. It started to kind of develop on its own until like a whole civil war began after the death of I believe Danilo Halic afterwards, that created like sort of a power vacuum because I think he didn't have any heirs if I remember correctly. It went to a civil war, and then the Kingdom of Galicia Volhynia got annexed, by Galicia being annexed by Poland, by the Kingdom of Poland, and Volhynia being annexed by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But I mean, she's not going to talk about the Kingdom of Galicia Volhynia here, apparently. So
Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian history are all intrinsically connected and intertwined. Follow Midwestern Marx.
They might be connected and intertwined, but it's not necessarily in a positive way. See, so it's kind of, again, this is kind of like misleading as well.
For the latest news, Marxist theory, and history content. And as always, fuck NATO.
Okay, we're gonna.
So from the first video.
So we're gonna get into video number 2. I'll take a little break just to see if there's anyone jumping in. Если ты украинец и хочешь, чтоб твой единственный залетел, тебя понимают, то говори по-русски. По-русски не говорю, я по-українськи. Я можу трохи розуміти російську, я можу. Ну, я погану мову читаю, але по-русски не говорю, я перепрошую. Я не народився в у родині, які говорили по-російськи. Я тільки по-українськи. Я по-українськи, французьки або англійськи говорю. Я російську мову не знаю. Її трохи розумію, але не її погано говорю. Я перепрошую. Okay, so video number 2. I mean, except if you want to, I don't know, except if you kind of understand in English, I don't know. Vladislav, yeah. But Vladislav, are you like from Russia or are you from Ukraine? Ты російський чи українець? Okay, I'll wait. So I'll just okay. So I'll just do the second part.
So from the first video of this series, we discussed how Kievan Rus.
Again, I apologize. I don't know why this does this. I have no clue. So I apologize if you see like a massive like green thing. I apologize. I don't know why this happens. Like it happens to certain videos and certain it doesn't. I mean, it happens rarely, but I don't understand why this happens. So anyways, so I'll try to, yeah, maybe I'll do this maybe, and yeah, maybe we can kind of look at like this. I mean, it's not practical, but it's a solution. Let's say it like that.
Rus or Rus is not actually the first Ukrainian state, but a kingdom that was the predecessor to Eastern Slavic Europe.
Hold on. You're already doing the Ukrainian People's Republic. Are you? Hold on. So you're not going to talk about like Galicia Volhynia. You're not even going to talk about the Zaporozhian host. You're already jumping from Kievan Rus to the Ukrainian People's Republic as if nothing happened between the two. I mean, okay, but let's carry on.
namely Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. But now let's talk about the first Ukrainian state, or rather states. So in
Yeah, I mean, that'd be true if the UNR would be the first Ukrainian state if it was the first Ukrainian state. Again, like you're not talking about the Kingdom of Galicia Volhynia, which could be technically seen as the real first manifestation of a Ukrainian state. Nor are you going to talk about the Zaporozhian host. Oh man, this is okay. This is weird. I mean, even if she is like because I believe like Midwestern Marx is associated with like Russia today, but and so yeah, obviously they're gonna have like a pro-Russian bias. But even if you want to have like a pro-Russian bias and debunk Ukrainian nationalists, there are like Russian talking points who tried in BTFO like the idea of Galicia Volhynia being like a Ukrainian or the Zaporozhian host being Ukrainian. So I don't know why aren't you doing why do you jump directly to the Ukrainian People's Republic? I don't know. Okay, but anywho.
1917, following the October Revolution, which led to a Bolshevik victory in Russia, there were two states that sprung up in Ukraine: the Ukrainian SSR, headed by the Bolsheviks, and the Ukrainian National Republic, or the Ukrainian People's Republic, which was set up in 1918 in Lviv by the
That's not exactly true. Number one, the Ukrainian People's Republic forms itself in territorial Ukraine by Mikhailo Khrushchevsky. I mean, it's a very long and complicated story, so I'll try to sum it up as best as I can. So basically, yeah, Russia. So yeah, territorial Ukraine. What do I mean by territorial Ukraine? I mean the Ukrainian part, which was part of the Russian Empire. That's where the Ukrainian People's Republic forms itself. So it forms itself from intellectuals and basically kind of like academics from territorial Ukraine, so Russian Ukraine. Um, and so basically like there's also like yeah the February Revolution, which he omits. I don't know why. Which basically sees the rise of the Kerensky regime. So the Kerensky regime basically makes like Tsar Nicholas II, I believe he forces him to abdicate, and he becomes like president. And so basically, because of this phenomenon, a lot of like the Russian colonies basically kind of see, oh well, the Russian Empire is basically falling. We might as well, start declaring independence and start making like a project for various independence and statehood. Now, Ukraine was eventually one of those states, and and basically like they go to Kerensky. Khrushchevsky goes to Kerensky, and basically like tries. He has like negotiations with him. Eventually, the negotiations were made for independence. However, Kerensky didn't really support like independence for any of the Russian colonies. Really, he basically wanted to maintain the territorial mass of Russia, just under like more of a liberal face, like a nicer Russian empire, if you want. And so basically, like he would only grant like autonomy status to Ukraine. So I mean, Khrushchevsky, because you need to understand also something about like the Russian Empire, is that um, forming national political parties for various like nationalities came very late, unlike in other empires such as the Ottoman Empire or Austria-Hungary, which basically like led and kind of like authorized, if you want, like national minorities to form parties and sit in the diets. Russia was kind of like late to the party because they didn't really want like yeah, because a lot of the Russian czars didn't really want like national parties to exist because they kind of wanted to keep monopoly on power, so on and so forth. And it's only like later, like very late in like the late 19th century, early 20th, where that phenomenon kind of like became like a reality in the Russian Empire. So because Khrushchevsky was aware that like uh, yeah, political basically like elites or political formations of parties were basically kind of a new phenomenon within the Russian Empire. He didn't really have enough bargaining power, so he had to settle for autonomy. And it's only after the flux of like the beginning of the October Revolution, because basically the Kerensky regime got BTFO'd and the various like national states which gained autonomy um, basically kind of recognize that Kerensky is the real like legitimate like ruler, if you want. they kind of said, well, then if Kerensky basically got like overthrown, Russia's entering like a period of chaos. Might as well just jump off the sinking ship. So yeah.
Ukrainian nationalists. As I'm sure you're familiar with and aware of, just because the Bolsheviks were able to seize state power did not mean that there were. As I'm sure you're familiar with and aware of, just because the Bolsheviks were. And the Ukrainian National Republic, or the Ukrainian People's Republic, which was set up in 1918 in Lviv by the Ukrainian nationalists.
Ukrainian nationalists. Like, you're saying Ukrainian nationalists, but again, you're saying this like as a form of abstraction. It basically, not to mention that, yeah, as I said, like it forms in territorial Ukraine, and the people who form it were actually socialists. Khrushchevsky, Vinichenko, Petlura, they were socialists. Okay, they believed in socialism. They were part of like a party which was called the Ukrainian Revolutionary Social Democratic Party. Yeah, it's social democratic, but I'll just remind for people, like social democracy in like that period is very different from social democracy that we know as today. Like social democracy, like at that time, could be seen as more like democratic socialists. However, yeah, people like Khrushchevsky, for example, like he actually spent like some time in Galicia, which was under Austria-Hungary, and he actually knew like members of the Radical Party, the Ukrainian Radical Party, which was a very radical socialist, agrarian socialist party. They also believed in Ukrainian nationalism, so a left-wing form of Ukrainian nationalism. And so he spent like some time with them, eventually learning, trying to form like a basis for a similar party within the Russian Empire for Ukrainians eventually. And Khrushchevsky was pretty much like a Marxist. I'm just going to say he was pretty much a Marxist, but he also had like a consciousness of like the more like popular agrarian masses, because that's basically what the Ukrainians were. Ukrainians, the majority class of Ukrainians at that point was not the industrial proletariat; it was the peasantry. So he had more of like an agrarian socialist kind of position as well, even though like again he was more influenced by Marx than he was like say Mikhailo Drahomanov, who was like pretty much like a critique of Marx. But let's see what she has to say.
As I'm sure you're familiar with and aware of, just because the Bolsheviks were able to seize state power did not mean that there weren't other ideological groups that weren't still trying to take state power from them, which led to the Russian Civil
War. Wait, from them? They were trying to take state power from. They were basically trying to gain power for themselves. The Ukrainian People's Republic was already declared by Mikhail Khrushchevsky. It already existed. So they were the ones trying to take power from basically the Ukrainian left-wing nationalists. That's what. It wasn't the UPR trying to take power from the Bolsheviks. Like the Bolsheviks were Johnny-come-latelys, basically.
Civil War. And of course, Ukraine was no exception. Starting from Lviv and eventually making their way to Kyiv, the national.
Starting from Lviv? What are you talking about? The Ukrainian people, hold on, the Ukrainian the Ukrainian SSR, or at least like the first draft of it, was formed in eastern Ukraine. I believe the capital was Kharkiv, or at least the declared capital of the Ukraine. The first draft of the Ukrainian SSR, I believe, was Kharkiv, if I'm not mistaken. So what are you talking about? Like going to Lviv, like from the way to Lviv, the Bolsheviks like went all the way to the other side of Ukraine. They weren't in Lviv at that time. There would be like an experiment made by, I believe, Volodymyr Zatonsky, because he was actually like a Galician Ukrainian. He would try to make like a Soviet republic within Galicia, but that didn't last very long. That failed because it wasn't popular.
Nationalists set up the Ukrainian National Republic, which was governed by the Central Rada. The Ukrainian Central Rada was actually formed in Lviv in 1914.
Again, it was not formed in Lviv in 1914. I think she's confusing the foundation of the Ukrainian Siege Riflemen in Austria-Hungary with the Declaration of Independence in Ukraine, which was made in 1917. Like, yeah, there were like plans of making like something, but that was not made in Western Ukraine. The Western Ukrainian People's Republic was formed in 1918, so 1 year after the declaration of the independence of territorial Ukraine. What are you talking about?
And it supported Austria during World War I, but it didn't really.
Oh, it supported Austria during World War I. Hold on. territorial Ukraine was under the Russian Empire, so they were basically like forcefully drafted within the Russian troops. While yeah, Galicia, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was drafted within Austria-Hungary. It was basically like they were basically colonies of empires. Like it's like saying, oh well, the Senegalese in World War One supported the French. Yeah, obviously because they were a French colony. So yeah, the Senegalese riflemen, yeah, that was a French detachment because they were forced to make that detachment because they were a colony basically. It's not like as if Ukraine from 1914 to 1917 were like willfully cheering on, saying, yeah, we're gonna fight with the Russians, we're gonna fight with the Austrians. Like, no, they didn't necessarily want to fight in like World War One. What are you talking about?
Have any legitimacy, but what it did was it set up a foundation for an impending government. As Ukrainian nationalists declared independence in Lviv, it posed a problem because the Polish forces still believed it belonged to them. So what it
Hold on. So I believe you're talking about the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, which was formed by a man called Yevhen Petrushevich, who himself also was a social democrat. And eventually, yeah, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire falls in 1918, then yeah, you have the colonies of the Austro-Hungarian Empire declaring independence. Now, yes, she is correct in saying that there was like a conflict between Poland and Ukraine, because yes, eventually, yes, Poland's whole position was to to basically rebuild the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They called it like intermarium, which was supposed to be like this big confederation between Poles, Lithuanians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. Now, they wouldn't just attack Ukraine. The Polish forces wouldn't just attack Ukraine. They also attacked Lithuania. I believe it was the Battle of Vilno or the Battle of Vilnius. I don't know. However, I'm not aware if they did like operations within like modern day Belarusian territory. If they did, I'm not aware. And yeah, eventually, yeah, they would try and basically like take over like the Ukrainian part of Galicia because again, they wanted to do that state. They basically believed that they should rebuild like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
led to was hostile skirmishes between the Ukrainian National Army and the Polish forces, putting the UNR at a detriment. In February of 1919, the Bolsheviks were able to take Kiev and drive the nationalists westward. This is also when Simon Petlura, an infamous Ukrainian nationalist, became the head of state.
Well, hold on, because you're also, yeah. I mean, the problem is that she's omitting so much information because the Ukrainian war, the whole like Ukrainian War of Independence, is like a massive. I mean, I'll just say it was a massive shit show because you had like various rivalries on like political grounds, mainly because of some political mismanagement which was made by Khrushchevsky, which basically like turned Ukrainian against Ukrainian, and this is just like territorial Ukraine because I don't know why. I really I don't know what she's talking about because the Ukrainian People's Republic at that point it's only by 1919 with the Ukrainian Unification Act where the Ukrainian People's Republic and Western Ukrainian People's Republic would basically unite and form like one state. Um, and then there was also like talks on how it would be managed, but that's like a different conversation. Um, However, I mean, yeah, Simon Petlura doesn't like just magically come up as like the leader. There was if you want like an inter period between Khrushchevsky and Petlura. First of all, Khrushchevsky gets cooled by a man called Pavlo Skoropadsky. Okay, Pavlo Skoropadsky was basically like a monarchist, more of like a right winger, if you want. Like, yeah, he was more like a right winger conservative. Yeah, he believed that hegemonism should be like a form of monarchism. And eventually, he would coup Khrushchevsky because he basically got alienated when the Rada was formed. And this is one of Shakrai's main criticisms because Vasil Shakrai does talk about this in his book. That's because basically Khrushchevsky like kind of didn't want like a right wing faction to be like contrary to the left wing faction. So he kind of put like the right wingers like aside. And that kind of pissed off Skoropadsky because he didn't really support what Khrushchevsky was doing. So he basically like yeah he's the one who basically like allies with the Austro-Hungarians and Germans. Now Khrushchevsky of course for realpolitik reasons would also like support like more of the Central Powers. That's I would say more of a game of alliances. Like we're not gonna side with the Entente because Russia's part of the Entente. They're getting aid from France, Britain, and the United States and other Entente allies. So, and the Russians basically now were attacking Ukraine. Like both the whites and the reds at that point were basically like after Kerensky got like kicked out, they were basically going back for their war of conquest. They didn't want like the big mass of Russia to just fall and crumble. So they attacked like everybody. You had like that. Again, the Russian Civil War is a massive shit show, but yet it's one of my favorite like it's my favorite parts of history. It's I think one of my favorite like historical events ever because it's such a because in the same time it's like a mess, but it's kind of super interesting within it. But and the Ukrainian independence is kind of the same. It's a massive mess, but it's super interesting to study. So basically, because of Skoropadsky's coup, um, he basically like started doing like he started to reverse a lot of like the Khrushchevsky's policies, mainly the land, the basically like emancipating peasantry. He kind of like brought back feudalism, for example, which was not popular with the peasantry. And so because of like the unpopular policies of Skoropadsky, you had like somewhat of a united front between Ukrainian supporters of the Rada, Bolsheviks, anarchists, and even left-wing nationalists like the Borojbists and the Borbists as well, who would basically like unite and kick out Skoropadsky. And that's basically now the second president was not Petlura. Now Petlura didn't become like leader directly. Like the first one who kind of replaced Khrushchevsky was Volodymyr Vinnychenko. Now Volodymyr Vinnychenko, he was more of a radical guy. He was actually like a genuine, like very radical person, left wing. He was basically like a Bolshevik light without calling himself like a Bolshevik. Like he had some pretty radical left wing ideas. And by the way, he also trusted Lenin and the Bolsheviks to not attack the Ukrainian territory. So he kind of limited the Ukrainian army, which was a big mistake. Petlura, he gained certain power because he was the brains behind the coup against Skoropadsky. He was the one that led the troops to basically oust the Skoropadsky regime, and he gained some form of like popularity. He, I believe, even was like minister of something. I forget if he was prime minister of Ukraine or if he was like minister of defense. I'm not completely sure. But basically, yeah, he would beef with Vinnychenko because they had like some disagreements on certain positions, even though, like, again, Petlura also was a socialist. And Vinnychenko would resign, basically, for numerous reasons. Number one, because he was beefing too much with Petlura, but also because the Bolsheviks at that point had attacked Ukraine. So he would resign, and Petlura would basically become like the new leader.
Because the Bolsheviks were devastating the Ukrainian National Army, Petlura signed a pact with Poland.
I mean, devastating. You forget also that there was the whites on Ukrainian territory as well, so they had to fight. Yeah, I mean, Ukrainians were surrounded by enemies. I'm just saying, like, there were the Poles were attacking, the Russians were attacking. There were even like certain Romanian skirmishes on the Ukrainian territory, Hungarian skirmishes. I mean, that'd be a bit later. That'd be like more 1919s. But yeah, Bela Kun, for example, like tries to annex. I mean, even before Bela Kun, the Hungarians were trying to annex Transcarpathia. Transcarpathia at that point had like a sort of like a state called the Hutsul Republic, which was Ukrainophilic. They actually supported like joining the Ukrainian People's Republic. And the Hutsul Republic was actually attacked by the Hungarians because the Hungarians wanted Transcarpathia for themselves. The first attack, the Hutsul Republic would be victorious. The second attack under Bela Kun, though, they would lose. And Romania basically had skirmishes with Ukrainian on the question of places like, for example, like Transnistria, for example. So there were skirmishes between. In the same time, you had like Romania, but Moldova also had declared independence at that point. So you had like a sort of Romanian-Moldovan joint like defense and skirmishes between like Romanians and Moldovans on one side and Ukrainians on the other. Because borders were just like not set, so there was just a massive also fight for like territory.
Recognizing Galicia and Volhynia as Polish territory, in turn for military aid against the Soviets, and formally recognizing the Dnieper as Ukrainian territory.
That's not exactly what happened. Galicia and Volhynia, I mean, at that point, like, yeah, there were like Galician and Volhynian troops that still like fought and supported like the Ukrainian People's Republic. I mean, yeah, not to mention like Galicia and Volhynia were not ceded directly to Poland. Like they would be ceded like way later at the Peace of Riga, basically. The Peace of Riga basically gives like basically splits all these lands, basically splits the different lands to various camps. But no, like yeah, Galicia Volhynia like was still like pretty much like supportive of the Ukrainian People's Republic, was still like seen as Ukrainian territory, and yeah, was still seen as Ukrainian territory. So I don't understand what I don't understand where she's getting her information from.
Resulting in the start of the Polish-Soviet War. But by 1920, the Bolsheviks
The Polish Soviet in the Polish Soviet War, yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll give her credit for that. Yeah, she's correct on that. Yeah, basically, like when Poland and Ukraine, like kind of like yeah, yeah, they have to make like an alliance because they want to kick out, like they don't want the Russians to expand on their territories.
or the now Soviet Red Army began advancing closer towards Warsaw, or Warsaw, resulting in the Treaty of Riga that drew peace among both the Polish and the Soviet governments, and it split both Belarus and Ukraine into Polish and Soviet.
Oh, so you don't know this. So why the hell did you say that, like, so why did you say that? Never mind.
Territories, leaving the nationalists of both governments as governments in exile. But a lesser known fact about the UNR government is that in their struggle against the Soviets, 100,000 Ukrainian Jews were executed in pogroms. While Petlura did not say anything directly about killing Jews, his government and his army.
Yeah, he also made like decrees illegalizing like pogroms and stuff, and he said that anyone who basically like does pogroms should be basically arrested and shot. I'm just saying. So yeah, if you're going to tell the story, tell the full story. He even sent like troops to Makhno because they knew that Makhno was hunting down pogromists. Petlura would send like two of his generals to Makhno to basically like put down pogromists. Also, if there was like not enough action, is because also, and I'm not trying to listen. I'm not trying to like open wounds between Ukrainians and Poles. That's not what I want to do. But the Polish army also had like a lot of anti-Semitic generals. So if there's a speculation saying that if Petlura like openly stated saying, "Hey, don't pogrom people," that basically the Poles would let the Ukrainians to dry. That's one historical speculation. Think of it what you will.
He still believed in the Judeo-Muscovite Bolshevik trope in
at that point, no. What are you talking about? The only ones who kind of like were doing those connections were the White Russians. There was no like yeah, and even I mean there might have been like a couple of like hyper like or at least like a couple of like nationalists within like various parts of the Russian colonies who believed that, but that wasn't like a majority at that point.
That Jews would be loyal to Russia and communists first and foremost. This is important to note for the future because at the heart of Ukrainian nationalism is antagonism against the Russians and communists, which actually fed them.
I mean, again, it depends what kind of Ukrainian nationalism you're talking about. I mean, yeah, obviously every single like yeah, we have like animosity towards the Russians right now, and yeah, for a while because the Russians basically were the ones who occupied us the longest. But I mean to say that like there's also like a strong anti-communist like movement. Yeah, I mean, yes, but it's not how like you understand it. Is there's a sort of anti-communist position because it's sometimes tied to basically like Russian imperialism. That's the problem. Otherwise like yes, a part of the Ukrainian nationalist movement was actually formed by within like Ukrainian communists. Again, people like Vasil Shakrai, for example, he was a communist, but he was also a staunch Ukrainian nationalist. Same for Serhiy Mazlakh. Same for people like Shumsky, even though you could say that Shumsky was a Borodjbist. He wasn't exactly like a communist to begin with, but yeah, and he was kind of forced to, be part of the Bolsheviks once the Bolsheviks like won. But he was still like a voice of opposition within the Bolshevik party, and he's considered himself to be somewhat of a communist, and even pushed the National Communist line. Like he supported like national communism also. So to say that like oh yeah, well all the Ukrainians are like against communism, not really. There was like communist Ukrainians who are staunch and ardent like nationalists as well. But of course, she's not going to talk about this, obviously.
Their anti-Semitism, and this remains true to this day. Follow Midwestern Marx for more history.
Well, I mean, again, it depends on what nationalist position you're talking about. Like, yeah, third position, maybe like far right, like Ukrainian nationalism, could hold like some anti-Semitic beliefs, but liberal nationalism, economic nationalists, centrist nationalists, left-wing nationalists such as myself, we're not race obsessed. Like we're not really race obsessed. We're not even race obsessed to begin with.
History content, more Marxist theory, and news. As always, fuck NATO. Slava Ukraini! So from the first video of this series...
Shit, sorry.
Slava Ukraini!
Okay, hold on. Taking a breather, just gonna look at chat. It's normal that the video glitches on your screen. No, it's not normal. I don't know why it yeah, I don't know why that does. I don't know why that happens. Okay, yeah, take care, somebody. Take care. Okay, so episode number 3, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Oh boy. Okay, let's see what she has to say.
Slava Ukraini! Heroyam Slava! Slava Nazi! What do these words that have captured the nation
Slava Ukraini
even mean? This is a series that will study and debunk Ukrainian nationalist tropes and propaganda that is all around us today. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes, glory to the nation have now made their way into mainstream lingo, with even US politicians and supporters of Ukraine repeat what are far-right nationalist slogans.
Far-right nationalist slogans. Wait until you wait. Hold on, because Slava Ukraini wasn't even like a far-right nationalist slogan to even begin with. First of all, Slava Ukraini could be basically first traced back to the 19th century with Ukrainian sort of socialists, if you want, that basically were using it. And actually, the response to Slava Ukraini back in the 19th century was not Heroyam Slava, obviously, but Цілому світі слава. So to in all the world glory. So it was more of like a internationalist message there. But anywho, let's continue.
Popularized by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So let's talk real quick about the OU.
Again, it was not popularized by the Ukrainian, or at least it was not. I mean, if she's talking about like by the OUN or something like that, no, it was not published by the OUN. The OUN just took like already existing symbols. I mean, Slava Ukraini was even yelled or shouted even under the UPR days. It's just that like most of the responses that the OUN would bring did not exist. It'd be brought like later. But Slava Ukraini like has like a history going back from the 18th century. Even Taras Shevchenko wrote like Slava Ukraini in one of his poems. And Taras Shevchenko was pretty much like a socialist.
UN. Inspired by ideas by Ukrainian fascist Dmitro Dontsov,
to call Dmitro Dontsov a fascist, I wouldn't go that far. He was an integrist nationalist. He was definitely like an integrist. But to say that he was like a fascist, not really, because he would even leave the OUN by, I believe, 1929, if I'm not mistaken. He would leave the OUN and he'd just become like a professor. He wouldn't even get involved within like the OUN activities like during the war. So I mean, but he was definitely like an integrist nationalist, but I wouldn't go as far as to classify him as like a fascist. I don't even think that Dontsov himself saw himself as a fascist. He might have had like some inspirations ideologically from Italian fascism, but I think it was more influenced by like people like Charles Maurras, was more like a integrist nationalist than say like a genuine like third positionist or something like that.
OUN was formed in 1929 in Vienna by Yevgen Konovalets by uniting various far-right extremist Ukrainian nationalist groups.
I mean, there were like some far-right groups that were eventually like, that were basically like in there. But Yevgen Konovalets also supported like, and I'm not joking with this because there are sources that have been found. There are letters of his that have been found, where he basically like supported actually like uniting with Ukrainian Bolsheviks. I'm not joking. Like I am not joking. Like letters of his were found and shit within the Soviet archives that he was writing to the Ukrainian Soviet government for basically weapons and stuff.
Groups such as the Ukrainian Military Organization.
The Ukrainian Military Organization was not far right. The Ukrainian Military Organization. The Ukrainian military organization was basically just a sort of like a military org, but it didn't have like a leading ideology. I mean, even Petrushevich himself was more like a left-winger, was also part of the Ukrainian military organization, and he was actually kicked out by Konovalets, hilariously, For what reasons I don't know, but he got pushed out of the organization, and even Petrushevich would have to leave Poland and go into exile in Germany, and he would continue like a more left-wing version of the Ukraine military organization. So no, the UVO was not like far right or fascist. They had no leading ideology at all,
The Ukrainian National
apart for Ukrainian like patriotism, some form of revanchism as well. But no, it was not like fascist in any way.
Association, the Union of Ukrainian Fascists, and the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine.
Okay, the Union of Liberation for Ukraine was actually a socialist organization. So again, like yeah, like there might have been like there were what two organizations that you mentioned which could be considered as like far right or fascist. Even then, like the Association of Ukrainian Fascists were led by a guy named Nicholas Siborsky. Siborsky like was more of a civic nationalist in many occasions. But I digress.
They operated first in eastern Galicia, infiltrating institutions to obtain positions of power and spread their ideals of Ukrainian fascism.
I mean, they were technically already speaking like Ukrainian nationalists within and I'm not talking about like the OUN. I'm talking about like left-wing Ukrainian nationalists, centrist Ukrainian nationalists who were already doing some form of like patriotic works anyways. So yeah, what they were doing is more like going in competition with the left and the center. They were basically blaming the Ukrainian left for the failure of the Ukrainian statehood. So basically, people like Khrushchevsky and Vinnychenko were not exactly popular, and yeah, the centrists basically were kind of like a rival position because they didn't really hold like a either left wing or right wing position. They were just like advocating for, hey, we need our statehood back, right? We want our statehood back.
OUN's ideology was that of National Socialism.
No, I mean, first of all, that's not exactly true. Like the OUN, first of all, under Konovalets, was more of like national Bolshevik light. Because Konovalets actually like the main objective of Yevhen Konovalets was to avoid fratricidal war. He would actually even, as I said like a bit earlier, Yevhen Konovalets would even write to the Ukrainian Soviet government for weapons, and the Ukrainian Soviet government actually were willing to give weapons to Konovalets. They had to first like talk to Stalin, and basically Stalin said, no, you will not give weapons to the to Konovalets. And then after Konovalets' death in Rotterdam by a Soviet agent, you would basically have a split between two factions. You would have a more like moderate faction led by Andriy Milnik. Andriy Milnik, who was more of like, who was basically who on his side had people like Mykola Tsiborsky and people like Oleg Olzhich, who were actually very staunchly against National Socialism. The branch that actually was more influenced by ethno-nationalism was the branch led by Stepan Bandera. So they had like intellectuals like Yaroslav Stetsko. Yaroslav Stetsko was actually like a genuine, like very harsh, like ethno-nationalist. His ideas came from people like Mykola Mikhnovsky. Mykola Mikhnovsky, who was also like kind of like the theorizer of a Ukrainian ethno-nationalist position in the 19th century. However, his positions back in the 19th century and even 20th century were not popular. Like what was popular was the more like socialist position of Ukrainian nationalism, the more socialistic Ukrainian nationalism, the more left-wing branch of Ukrainian nationalism. So to say that the OUN was like full-fledged like NatSoc, no, not really.
Type of fascism, which was
not really, because there was like rivalries within it. One was more civic, supportive of more like a basis or which looked like Italian fascism, and the more like hard right branch, like the hardcore branch, which was more ethno-nationalist, who supported more of like something that looked like National Socialism. Now, granted, there were even splits within the Banderit faction. There were people like, for example, people like Mitringa, for example, who was more of a left-winger and who actually did not really support, like, or who dropped basically like the ethno-nationalist positions by 42. Hold on, hold up. Ils sont sortis. So yeah, so this idea that Mikhnovsky was like, or sorry, Mikhnovsky. What am I talking about? The people like me that like the OUN was like genuinely like full fledged like Natsok. Not really. Like a branch was, but not yeah, but not the entire organization was, because again there was like ideological rivalries within it. And even by 1942, like the ideology mainly gets dropped. There were maybe like a minority of people who still held like ideological positions, but it wasn't the majority by then. Like there were yeah, I mean there were like left wingers. There was like a left wing branch within like the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Even during the war, people like Taras Borovets, for example, actually support more of a socialist messaging. But then again, people can view it as like a legit or not legit. If you want, we can have like a separate conversation on this. We can have like a separate debate on the question later. But yeah, to say that like the OUN was like full fledged like Natsok or some shit like that, no, that's not exactly true. One branch was, the other wasn't, and then there were like more like socialist supportive branches. The Banderites had their own split, again, like people like Mitringa, for example. And by 1942, the ideology basically gets dropped. So yeah, it's pretty misleading what you just said there.
Of course, followed by Hitler's Germany and the Croatian Ustaše that sought to.
And Croatian Ustaše, not really, because the Croats were kind of far away. More like, yeah, not to mention the Ustaša didn't really have like much of I don't think they had like much of an international following, not like say like Italian fascism or National Socialism, which actually did provide like a sort of new way model, because the Ustaša, if I'm not mistaken, the Ustaša would basically form themselves, or at least form the independent state once Yugoslavia basically gets completely wrecked. So yeah, once monarchist Yugoslavia gets wrecked, the Ustaše come to power. Beforehand, they don't hold power. And I mean, if there was like some form of like I don't know if there were like some connections between like the organization of Pavelic and say like, I don't know, like the branch of Bandera together, I have no clue. Like I don't know. Like I have to do more research into it. But I kind of doubt it. I know in Czechoslovakia the Banderites had like connections with Slovakian fascists. I have a source, but I still haven't got to reading it though. So yeah, I'll probably read it and make up and kind of explain maybe in a community post or something what those relations were. I even found like an article on like the OUN's like kind of international relations. Still didn't have the chance to read it, but yeah, the day I read it, like yeah, I'll probably like showcase some points in there to showcase if I find something interesting.
Create an ethno-state of a nationalist dictatorship led by the economic elite and the intelligentsia of the said nation.
What? Okay, because I hear this argument like constantly thrown, like saying shit like, oh well, you see, the Banderites actually got funding from like the big landlords and so on. And each time I ask the question, okay, well, can you give me names of these individuals? Can you give me at least one individual name that gave money to like the OUN? None of them can give me a name. So I mean, I don't know where this fabrication comes from. Like, if that's true, please give me sources. Like, give me sources. I'm willing to look at them. Yeah, because I've been hearing this from Marxists like for 9 years now, and I still haven't found like a simple source. A single source basically saying, yeah, the economic elite was behind the OUN. No, like most of the funding the OUN had was by robbing Polish banks. What are you talking about?
The OUN was led by 10 commandments of the Ukrainian Nationalist Revolutionary, which will go as follows. You will attain a Ukrainian state or die in battle for it. You will not permit anyone to defame the glory or honor of your nation. Remember the great days of our struggles. Be proud that you are the inheritor of the struggle for Volodymyr's trident. Avenge the deaths of the great knights. Do not speak about matters with anyone, only those with whom it is essential. Do not hesitate to undertake the most dangerous deeds, should this be demanded by the good of the cause. Treat the enemies of your nation with hatred and ruthlessness. Neither pleading, nor threats, nor torture, nor death shall compel you to betray a secret. Aspire to expand the strength, riches, and size of the Ukrainian state, even by means of enslaving foreigners. The OUN saw itself as the greatest and only representation and authority over the Ukrainian people, and it sought to
However,
build
I'll say this, like again, not every single OUN member followed those 10 commandments. Like again, people like Stiborsky, he didn't support like National Socialism. Even, by the way, fun fact, because of Stiborsky's like anti-Nazi position, the OUN and Abwehr relations actually soured, and it's only after his assassination that OUN and Abwehr relations actually resumed. So again, I think like the 10 Commandments. I mean, the 10 Commandments might have been like for a general thing, but not everyone like followed those 10 Commandments. Yeah, even people like Oleg Olzhich, who basically read Mein Kampf because he actually knew German. Olzhich Olzhich basically came to an anti-Nazi position as well. He was even like like killed by the Nazis for it in Sachsenhausen. But yeah,
a Ukraine for Ukrainians, dominated by the capital of the
again, people like Stiborsky was a civic nationalist, so he didn't believe in this idea of like ethno-nationalism.
wealthy kulak class and a nationalist dictatorship.
Again, like wealthy kulak class, like what wealthy kulak class? What wealthy kulak class? Again, give me names. Give us names. The people want names.
Cleansing out those who were deemed racially or ethnically inferior, and even Ukrainian Bolsheviks. Watch and
Yeah, obviously, because the Ukraine Bolsheviks, in certain cases, were seen as traitors. But again, as I said, Yevhen Konovalets was actually wrote letters to the Ukrainian Soviet government because he knew of the existence of national communists. He wanted an alliance with them because, as I remind, Yevhen Konovalets' his whole objective was to avoid fratricidal war.
follow Midwestern Marx for part 2. Hi, this is part 2 of the video on the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists.
Okay, for part 2, let's see. Okay, so here we go for part 2.
So the OUN operated heavily in the Polish-controlled Eastern Galicia, and because of Polish oppression on the Ukrainian identity, they were able to recruit en masse. Because of the fraternity with the OUN and the German National Socialist Party, when the Germans invaded Soviet Ukraine, they were celebrated by locals and had an ease with moving in. The OUN was under the impression that the Germans would help them create an independent Ukrainian state, meaning a National Socialist Ukrainian state.
Again, as I said before, there was only one specific branch that basically supported like the idea of like this ethno-nationalist position. That was the branch of like that was the position of people like Yaroslav Stetsko, for example. Now, it's unfortunate for me when it comes to sources wise, because I can't find anything that Stetsko might have written in the interwar period. So if anyone has sources about this, please share. I will get to them eventually because I have so much, like I got so much reading to do on the various sources. But no, like this idea that like, yeah, I mean, this idea that the whole entirety of the OUN believed in National Socialism is not true, because you had people like, yeah, you had like anti-Nazi positions within the OUN, even before like 1942. Like, yeah, people like Olzhich, for example, was fucking killed for his anti-Nazi positions. Same for Stiborsky. Stiborsky, as I said before, Stiborsky, because of Stiborsky's anti-Nazi positions, he soured relations with the Germans. And it's only after he dies that the relations with the Germans come back. But even this idea that like, oh, in the war they were cheering on like the Germans, even that is like not exactly true, because when the Germans attack Poland, there are Ukrainian nationalists from the OUN that actually take up arms and fight alongside the Poles against the German invasion. Not to mention that the OUN did eventually, apparently, there's also sources apparently that say that the OUN did try to get like that certain like Ukrainian nationalists, they tried to gain support from the Allied powers, but it didn't really achieve on anything because the Allied powers were basically like more supportive of Poland existing. They didn't take Ukrainians seriously, except for Belarusians. The only like small independence that they got was in 1938, when Czechoslovakia basically kind of ceded Carpathian land and kind of helped the Ukrainians form a state there. It was led by a man called Augustin Voloshin, who was a Greek Catholic priest. And now, yeah, he was more of like a conservative, if you want, more like, yeah, more like conservative guy. But I mean, funnily enough, like the first people that the OUN actually fought in 1938, because yeah, for the Ukrainians actually, the war kind of begins in 1938 because the Hungarians, who were under, who were basically under like, well, I mean, Horthy himself was not a fascist, but the Arrow Cross Party eventually did like partake within operations, and the Arrow Cross Party, I mean, even in late, like yeah, by the late period of the war, would eventually get into power in Hungary, but Horthy does eventually attack Carpathian Ukraine, and the OUN actually like the first adversary that the OUN actually fights are the Hungarians, who are an Axis power, because Hungary was an Axis power.
State. But Hitler also hated Slavic people and wanted to exterminate them. So quickly after
While Hitler did hate Slavic people, certain cadres of the National Socialist Party did not have those anti-Slavic perceptions. It's people like Rosenberg, for example, would constantly beef with Hitler on the Slavic question, um, and even Himmler. I mean, you could. I mean, I don't know if it was like sheer opportunism or if it was genuine though, because Himmler would basically like actually like open up the idea that like for the formation of like all these like Eastern European and even Caucasian and Central Asian SS legions in the future. But again, I mean, I don't know if it was for sheer opportunism or if it was genuine. I think it was more for sheer opportunism, um, mainly because I mean I'm focusing basically on the recallings of like one man of the name of Mustafa Shokai, who was like a Kazakh who basically came to Germany. He actually wanted to be like the leader of the Turkestan Legion, but I mean he basically declined from that position later on because he saw how the Central Asian POWs were treated. They were basically treated really badly, so he said, "No, I don't want anything to do with you people." Actually, so he would die like a year after of a stroke, I think, in Berlin.
declaring an independent National Socialist state, the leaders of the OUN, such as Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukiewicz, were imprisoned by the German army. Andrei Melnik and his faction of the OUN continued to work in collaboration with the Germans, however.
I mean, it depends on the Milnikite because a lot of Milnikites were also with Taras Borovets. Taras Borovets was basically fighting a four-front war. Also, there was like another faction of the Milnikites that basically fled because basically, yeah, the Germans basically like were controlling the entirety of the Ukrainian state. What I'm talking about is the Bukovinian Expeditionary Force. Um, I mean, there were like individual Milnikites, if you want, that did collaborate. Certain did collaborate, which ended up afterwards executed by the Germans because they kind of had like a change of position, saying, okay, maybe the Germans are not exactly our friends. So they saw like yeah, so they kind of realized like the reality like directly. Um, and and also, why did Andriy Milnik get to this position? I think is the ultimate question. Is because for Andriy Milnik, a anti-German struggle for Andriy Milnik was quasi impossible because basically like for him, the logistics may be like manpower, equipment, even institutional wise, and even ally wise, so realpolitik wise, um, was basically impossible. I mean, he would kind of be proven wrong because the UPA and the Bulbists would actually like would actually put up like yeah, pretty much a fearsome fight. I mean, they would lose in the end, but like all of us, yeah, all of them would lose. But yeah, they still put up like pretty much of a fight against like all forms of like invasive armies, may it be like the Armia against Armia Krajova, may it be against the Bolsheviks, maybe against the troops of the Third Reich, or others such as like the Romanians and the Hungarians, for example. They would actually like lead, yeah, they would actually like lead pretty much like a fearsome struggle. And I'm saying this like from a purely like central position. I'm being like completely objective. I'm not taking like a subjective position here. Also, another thing that I forgot to mention about the OUN, ideologically wise, is that the OUN and Bukovina. So yeah, Bukovina at that point was under the Kingdom of Romania. The OUN and Bukovina was actually formed by socialists, and it was actually made as like a self-defense unit against the Romanian authorities who were basically like attacking like Ukrainian institutions. So yeah.
however. So this is where we first see the split between the Stepan Bandera's faction of the OUNB and Andriy Melnik's faction of the OUNM. The OUNB, led by Bandera, was actually much bigger and much more youthful, violent revolutionaries. And under the orders of Bandera while in prison, the OUNB led the massacre of over 150,000 Ukrainian Jews, Poles.
I mean, Bandera. Well, the Bandera faction eventually did have like a strong animosity towards Poles. The actions towards the Poles were actually led by the Lebedь faction. So it was one particular faction that actually partook like in the massacre of Poles. It wasn't the entire organization. And even within the Banderites, there were people who actually preferred to have like the anti-Nazi struggle. People like, for example, Vasily Ivaki, for example, would fight and die in combat against the Germans. And there were other factions of like more left-wing Banderites who didn't partake in like the attack on Poles.
And communists.
But yes, it was eventually a massive tragedy. It was also criticized by other factions of the UN, such as the faction of Taras Borovets. Taras Borovets would actually criticize that attack and that slaughter and said that it was a bloodbath that was completely useless and it didn't achieve anything.
In collaboration with the German army, such as the massacre in Volhynia. And it was OUN propaganda and calls that popularized Slavo.
However, I'm not sure that that Midwestern Marx are fans of Poland either. I'm just saying, because a lot of Marxist Leninists, because I've been in those circles for a while. I know because I've seen like some pretty much like anti Polish rhetoric coming from Marxist Leninists as well. So I don't think that you genuinely care what happened to the Poles in Volhynia. I think you're just using it as a virtue signal, which is pretty disgusting.
Ukraini, Heroyam Slava, Slava Nazi. Stepan Bandera was
that slogan was already popularized like before the war. So yeah, these were all these things were done basically when the various organizations were already writing like their ideology and stuff. This was way before the war.
Was later released by the Germans as the Soviets were gaining more territory, and he later fled to Munich where he would be assassinated. But the CIA helped Mykola Lebed and other members of the OUNB immigrate into the United States and start anti-Soviet nonprofits and think tanks that dictated Western thought on Soviet Ukraine and disseminated propaganda even to this day. And according to the CIA, 80% of those from Western Ukraine that immigrated into the United States from displaced person camps remained loyal to Bandera. And
75%. I mean, according to the CIA,
is their children who were
even if it's CIA numbers, I sincerely doubt it. But I don't have the counter evidence for that. But I sincerely doubt that 75% remain loyal to Bandera. I'm pretty sure that most people just wanted to live like normal lives at that point. There are even Banderites who basically joined like socialist parties and stuff, and who basically who basically kind of abandoned like the more Banderite ideologies. It's people like, for example, people like Boris Levitsky, for example, was actually would join like a socialist organization. Ironically, he would actually become like a genuine like socialist.
Telling you that NATO is the good guy in this fight.
Not really. I mean, there are critiques of NATO even within like the nationalists that you're trying to to basically smear. There's like far right, there's like far right like Ukrainians who don't like NATO either. But okay.
The OUN were not just National Socialist collaborators; they were National Socialists in their own right. So when you hear Pelosi or Zelensky say their phrase,
hold on, by 1942, again, like the ideology is dropped by 1942, because the Germans basically screw over like the Ukrainian statehood. They arrest basically Stetsko, they arrest Bandera, they throw everybody in jail. And basically they replace everyone with a guy named Erich Koch. Erich Koch was not sympathetic to the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, nor was he sympathetic to the Ukrainian insurgent army. But yeah.
Just remember which movement they're paying ode to, a National Socialist Ukrainian one.
I mean, when they use these slogans and stuff, do you really think they're doing it out of ideological reasons? And do they really adhere to like Bandera's ideology? Or they're viewing him as more of like a national liberation figure? Now again, it's controversial and stuff. I agree with you that it's very controversial. But I mean, context is needed. Do you think that every single person who says like Slava Ukraini is like technically speaking, like a secret Natsok and stuff who hates like national minorities, or are they just doing it because they're basically like kind of patriotic and so on? I don't know. You tell me.
Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to follow Midwestern Marx for the latest news, Marxist theory, and history content. And as always, fuck NATO.
I mean,
You want to make fast money?
I mean, it's so funny. She says like "fuck NATO." What the fuck are you gonna do about it, though? Yeah. The thing is, yeah, you can hate NATO all you want, but what the hell are you gonna do about it?
Bet a Ukrainian nationalist $100 that they can't name a Ukrainian Bolshevik without looking it up.
People like Zatonsky, people like Skripnik. I don't know, man. They have to look that up.
Because according to Ukrainian nationalist propaganda, it was the Russians who came and forced Ukraine into becoming a Soviet republic against their will. And
well, to some extent, yeah, they're kind of right. Because again, like, where does the Bolshevik movement begin? It begins in Russia. Even Shakrai. I mean, again, I'm gonna cite like Vasil Shakrai and Serhiy Mazlakh a lot because, well, they were basically people from the Communist Party of Ukraine. Shakrai, especially, like actually had like a position within the first formation of the first draft of the Ukrainian SSR. So during the entire War of Independence period, and yeah, Vasil Shakrai saw some pretty shady stuff going on within the Ukrainian Bolsheviks, and especially like within the Russian Bolsheviks as well. And he would actually leave the Bolsheviks and would try to form his own like communist party, which would be rival to the Bolsheviks. And he actually wanted also to be more like united and supportive of the Ukrainian People's Republic. Hell, he would even try and have like a truce with the anarchists because he saw it as more of a Ukrainian movement. He would even go to the Kuban and where there were like Ukrainian cultural centers and stuff and have like relations with them. And that's where he got killed by the whites, by the way. Which, according to a historian, uh, he was apparently sold out by the Reds to the whites, and that's how the whites found out that he was in Kuban. But again, that's like a bit more conspiratorial. So think of it what you will.
And that Soviet Ukraine was just a colony of the USSR, completely
It kind of was, though.
erasing the history of Ukrainian Bolsheviks. Welcome to Debunking Ukrainian National.
I mean, most Ukrainian Bolsheviks, you could say, were kind of. I mean, there were like two kinds of Ukrainian nationalists. There were Ukrainian Bolsheviks. Sorry, there were Ukrainian Bolsheviks who eventually were pretty much like loyal to Lenin and the party, and who hold like the ideology as core belief, kind of like a religious fundamentalist a little bit. And then there were like Ukrainian Bolsheviks who were a bit more nationalistic, like people like Vasil Shakrai, for example, like people like Nicola Skripnik, which I know she's going to bring up because yeah, I'm kind of cheating. I kind of watched the videos a bit like before, so I kind of remember the talking points. But she's gonna bring up Skripnik and she's gonna say some bullshit about Skripnik. But yeah, I'll tell you why it's bullshit when she brings it up. But yeah, there were like the phenomenon of national communism existed as well, and it was pretty much against the Leninist line too. So yeah. So again, even Ukrainian Bolshevism is not a monolith.
This is a series that will study and debunk Ukrainian nationalist propaganda that is all around us today. So the Bolshevik Party existed in all of the former colonies of Tsarist Russia, and in Ukraine they were one of the largest parties.
That's false. They were not one. They were not one of the largest parties. That is actually false. Ukrainian Bolsheviks were not exactly popular. They were popular within the cities, but according to Vasil Shakrai, basically Ukrainians were kind of like were not like urbanites even within cities. They were basically like peasants. So the people who supported the Bolshevik Party was basically like more like foreign people who were living within the Ukrainian cities. There were like some Ukrainians there. I'm not denying that, but no, to say that it was like a major party, that's not true. They were more supportive for, say, another left wing party, which was the Borodebists, who were a left wing nationalist agrarian socialist party. They had actually more members than the Bolsheviks, and they were actually and the Bolsheviks saw them as a threat. That's why they had to like destroy the party, basically like and absorb like whoever was left within the Bolsheviks. But they would make like their own lobby and kind of become like natcoms in the process. And then you had also the USDRP, which was, I would say, the leading one. Again, people like probably preferred like Khrushchevsky anyways, or people like Venichenko, and then and people like Petlura, but afterwards, yeah, Petlura would basically become like more associated with a too much violent period because it was basically like chaos at that point. But still, I mean, yeah, like when Petlura coups Skoropadsky, like all the peasantry is behind him.
1905, the Ukrainian Bolshevik Party led an armed uprising in Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv that was met with fierce brutality by the Tsarist army. A large part of the Ukrainian Bolshevik Party were born in eastern and
Again, that doesn't show that it was necessarily like super popular.
in southern Ukraine, areas that had voted for independence or had movements for independence in 2014 after
Oh yeah, independence. I mean, there were people who said that like a lot of people who were supporting the quote unquote independence, a lot of them got money from various like shady people, but I'm not gonna get into that.
the fascist coup in Kiev, while western Ukraine
The fascist coup. Yeah, sure. I mean, again, like yeah, I mean, fascist coup. If it were a fascist, I'm just saying, if it were a fascist coup, um, I don't think there would be like I don't think there would be like a much, Jesus, I mean, a fascist coup. If it were like a real fascist coup, I think we would know at that point. Like, I think we would know that if it was like a real fascist coup. Because I mean, as someone who has actually read like stuff about like third position beliefs and so on, trust me, like that was not a fascist coup.
was a hotbed of reactionary nationalism. It's
A hotbed of reactionary nationalism. I mean, it's so funny because like technically speaking, you could say that like the reactionaries at this point were basically like the people supporting the Communist Party, because the Communist parties in Eastern Europe look more like conservative parties in the West than say like the right, which has a more like revolutionary message. But I mean, I digress. I digress.
important to note that many of the Ukrainian Bolsheviks were born in the Russian Empire
She's got Kaganovich behind her. Jesus.
because at that time Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire.
Yeah, okay, they were born in Ukraine, but just because you're born somewhere doesn't mean you identify with the place you were born. Like in that case, Filippo Marinetti is not Italian, he's Egyptian because he was born in Alexandria. Like that's such a stupid argument.
But the problem is that historians will erase them as Russian, even though
Well, no, they're not erasing them as Russian. It's either you identify with the place that you're born or you don't. Like there's no secret. And I know, like then you got like Marxist Leninists who say stuff like, "Oh, but no, you're getting into ideology too much. Why so much identity politics?" I don't know, man, because nationalism is a form of identity politics. That's the point of like nationalism. Doesn't matter if it's like right wing, left wing, third position, centrist, even yeah, even economic. Uh, it is going to be like based on like identity. It's I identify with the place that I am born with, and I support the independence or the struggle of the place that I am born with. Right? Otherwise, against my even otherwise again, like fucking Marinetti in that case is Egyptian, or Ernst Nikisch is Polish because he was born in like German Poland. It's such a stupid argument.
they were born in what is now considered Ukraine. So a day
Yeah, but again, like, did they identify with Ukraine? Is the ultimate question.
after the October Revolution, Ukrainian Bolsheviks too seized state power in Kiev and set up the Regional Committee of Protection of Revolution in Ukraine, a temporary protectorate of the Bolshevik Revolution. As stated in episode 2, Ukraine would undergo a vicious civil war of various ideologies competing for power, which would result in the creation of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and Polish Dominion in Western Ukraine. But now let's talk about some important Ukrainian Bolsheviks. In 1918, Demyan Korotchenko joined the Ukrainian Red Army to fight Ukrainian nationalists. He would later join the partisan movement, fighting Ukrainian and German fascists during the Great Patriotic War, and
Yeah, but again, you're not saying if this man was actually identifying as a Ukrainian. So why you're bringing this random guy up like this without saying, oh well, yeah, and actually he did identify with Ukraine and so on. Like that's a different thing. And so that would be more of an ideological war.
and then became the chairman of the Soviet Supreme in Ukraine, or essentially the president of Ukraine. Born in Donetsk, Mykola Skripnik was a devout revolutionary Marxist, having been arrested by the Tsarist government in 1901 and expelled from school from it. In March of 1918, he was appointed directly by Lenin as the chairman of Soviet Ukraine. He pioneered the Soviet Ukrainianization policies that sought to uplift the Ukrainian identity in a patriotic revolutionary
Yep, I have a community post about him if people are curious. Yeah, I do have a community post about good old Skripnik. Hold on
Marxist fashion, as opposed to the National Socialist movement born in Western Ukraine.
Dude, dude, like when Skripnik was fucking leader, like when Skripnik was leader, like National Socialism at that point wasn't even like present on the Ukrainian territory. At least when he became like leader, like yeah, the ideology of Ukraine of National Socialism was not even like expanding yet, not yet at least.
And
Germany was in full-fledged civil war at that point.
Vehemently anti-nationalist. He was
not vehemently anti-nationalist. He was pretty much like a nationalist himself. What are you talking about? He even would shoot himself because Stalin was reversing his policies. He would shoot himself in protest, not realizing that he was auto-purging himself. But yeah, he killed himself in protest basically against the reversal of Ukrainization policies because he wanted to maintain Ukraine in a form, or at least the Ukrainian SSR, as like an authentic Ukrainian national state. So yes, by definition, Skripnik was a nationalist. He was just not like kind of nationalist you like, but he was a nationalist. Yet again, he was a nationalist.
Was also behind the effort to standardize the Ukrainian language, although there remains many different dialects to this.
Yeah, hence why you could say that that Skripnik was basically a nationalist, because he tried to like form a form of coherent or at least like standardize like a positional language. He eventually like supported the emancipation. A lot of efforts on the peasantry was actually made under Skripnik, more than it was made on the proletarian, and basically like a real embracing of Ukrainization, which was basically put on the front. So you could say that basically Skripnik was a light nationalist. You could basically say that. He's seen as like a national communist too. So to say that he was anti-nationalist, it's so stupid. No, he was not anti-nationalist. If he supported Ukrainization, if he supported like Ukrainians embracing their identity and presenting itself like that, then he's not exactly an anti-nationalist because he's letting that flourish. He would even support he got into beefs with Shumsky. I'm not gonna lie. He got into beefs with Shumsky, for example, who was way more radical on the Ukrainian nationalist position. Shumsky being a left-winger himself. But to sit here and say that like, oh well, he was an anti-nationalist, no, not really. He was not as radical as say Shumsky, but no, he supported like basically like what Shumsky was proposing, just in a more light version. To the point of like him getting like really pretty much really scared of what was going once Stalin took power, to once again to the point of killing himself in protest.
This day, Ukrainians played a vital role in the construction of the Soviet Union. They were an integral part of the Bolshevik Revolution as well. Ukraine was not a colony of the USSR.
Yes, it was a colony of the USSR, because basically when Stalin comes to power, all that Ukrainization effort that you just brought up was completely removed. Even people like Infrared, for example, who is on your side, agrees with my position. He agrees that basically like when Stalin came to power, all the nativization policies got got basically like reversed, and Infrared actually justifies this by saying it was a necessary position because there needed to be a consolidation of central power, which I personally disagree, because I personally prefer Ukrainians to have a Ukrainian path towards whatever system they want. That's the Ukrainian nationalist position. That's like what the Ukrainian Bolsheviks supported, was a Ukrainian path to socialism. Not all of them, obviously, but out of members within the Communist Party of Ukraine, that's what they supported. At least the Shumsky branch. Certain people like Mykola Khvilovey also, who certainly was not a politician. He was more of like a writer. But yeah, a lot of even people like Volodymyr Sosyura, for example. Sosyura was actually in Petura's army. He was pretty much like a convinced like socialist, and he would basically survive. How did he survive the purges? I don't know by what magic he survived, but he would basically survive like the purges, and yeah, he would actually contribute to he would basically contribute to what could be seen as Ukrainian national Bolshevism, and basically like support like Ukrainian themes, Ukrainian national themes within his poetry. So yeah, while certain Ukrainian communists eventually did pave the way within the Ukrainian SSR, a lot of them could basically be seen as nothing more than just Russian vassals doing what Moscow wanted, while others would basically be seen in the Soviet Union with a negative light because they were seen as too nationalists. They were basically being degraded as just a bunch of Ukrainian nationalists, even though they were paving the way for a Ukrainian path towards socialism, which, from my perspective, left-wing nationalism is the only viable socialism that actually could work. But I digress. I digress. This is more of an ideological.
They were a guiding light of it. Follow Midwestern Marx for the latest news, Marxist theory, and history content. And as always, fuck NATO. If I had $1 for every time a Ukrainian said their language was banned...
Hold on. Oh man, we're getting into the language ban, which I just debunked. But hold on. Привет. Yeah, of course she will repeat the Z. Yeah, she does repeat the Z bullshit a lot. So yeah, that's basically what I'm trying. Yeah, what I'm trying to debunk right now. I'm losing my mind progressively because it's propaganda after propaganda that I've heard like so much, and that yeah, that basically I have to constantly like debunk every time. So it's nice to do it in a live reaction. So yeah, I hope I'm doing my best. I genuinely hope I'm doing my best because yeah, I hate her format. I really hate her format because she's using TikTok, and she's basically like talking about like some very hard, like complicated like topics, which are not exactly black and white, in like a 2 to 3 minute format video. And she basically omits a lot of information. A lot of information is omitted. Even like, I don't know, some like she confuses sometimes some events, such as like the second video on the Ukrainian People's Republic, where she says it was formed in 1914. Please stop. Please read like an authentic like history book on Ukraine. Midwestern Marx, please. I demand you please like interact with Ukrainian sources. But yeah, let's do the next part.
If I had $1 for every time a Ukrainian said their language was banned by the Soviets, I would be in the Pandora Papers with Zelensky by now. Welcome to Debunking Ukrainian Nationalism. This is a series that will study and debunk the myths behind Ukrainian nationalist propaganda that is all around us to this day. For me, one of the most egregious myths that Ukrainian nationalists propagate is that their language and identity was oppressed by the USSR.
Well, when Stalin came to power, it was. And again, Infrared, who is your ally, agrees with this point. He even said it when he was debating, what's his name? He was debating, I forget his name. Like he's like this guy who LARPs as like a Ba'athist. Even though apparently there's people who says this guy is like of Italian origin, but he LARPs as an Arab. But yeah, he basically like debated this like one like Marxist Leninist, and he said, dude, no, the complete annihilation of the nativization policy actually happened, and it was based in epic. That's Infrared's position.
Because it is so blatantly false and easy to dispute that it just shows the pure laziness of those folks that are repeating it. The first
yeah, laziness is when you read sources, apparently.
Text that I ever read by Lenin was on the national question.
Okay, the national question, which was written in... Unfortunately, she's not showing us the date, and the right of national self-determination. I mean, yeah, that's nice, but I mean, yeah, sure, Lenin wrote like nice things, but when he came to power, he did other things. You see, actions speak louder than words. That's the thing, that's the problem, is that it's nice to read like a nice piece of paper which provides you like an ideal or some form of ideological position to hold. But I mean, when you get into power, you're going to do other things that sometimes contradicts what you've written. And I believe that the right of nations of self-determination was written way before the Bolshevik Revolution, I believe.
Published in 1914, Lenin's
there we go, 1914. So before 1917, basically.
stated that it was the job of the oppressor nation, in this time Tsarist Russia, to earn the trust of the workers in the oppressed nation. Ukraine as an example.
Which, by the way, would be countered by the analysis of another national communist, who was called Mirsaid Sultan Galiev, who was a Volga Tatar, who basically said that no, there should be like a giant, massive, like national communist like revolution, because we can't trust the colonizer to just stop being a colonizer. That was Sultan Galiev's position. Now, Sultan Galiev, and of course, I'm waiting for like some ML to tell me that, oh, but Sultan Galiev was protected by Lenin and stuff. I know that he was protected by Lenin, but yeah, other national communists, such as people like Geden in Mongolia or Amar in Mongolia, or people like Shakrai, they basically got like completely ignored, and we're basically like we're basically seen as like traitors to the cause, or some stuff like that. So yeah. Oh, great. Now, Joseph Stalin, Marxism in the National and Colonial Question. Again, which was written before he ascended to power. When Stalin ascends to power, it's nice, he wrote this thing. Okay, great, he wrote this, nice. But he did other things in power, such as destroy the nativization policies.
Stalin, a national minority himself, also wrote Marxism and the National.
Yes, he was Georgian, but yet when he came to power, well, he basically adapted he adapted himself to more of the Tsarist, or if you want, like a Russian centralist kind of position. And not to mention that, like, there are some Georgians who consider Stalin to kind of be a traitor, because he's basically kind of the guy who actually helped, because after the fall of the USSR, there would be like massive ethnic conflicts within Georgia between South Ossetians and Abkhazians, and some would blame Stalin for basically like kind of creating like a process which would lead to that kind of ethnic conflict, because he basically founded the Abkhazian and South Ossetian autonomous Soviet republics. Even though apparently I'm not an expert on Georgian history, but I've heard like some people tell me that like Abkhazians were kind of the ones that basically unified like the concept of the various Georgian kingdoms. If there are Georgians who would watch this stream in the future, please feel free to basically like explain if this is true or not. Yeah, please do contribute to the conversation.
National question, in which he lays out what is a nation, how the rich orchestrate nationalism, and what solutions Marxists have to answer.
How the rich orchestrate nationalism. I mean, I always say that it's impossible to be a capitalist and a nationalist at the same time. It's not possible, because capitalists, what do capitalists support? They support more of the idea of a free market, of like the more globalization policy, right? So yeah, as I say, it's not possible to be like a capitalist and a nationalist at the same time. It's not possible, because yeah, the goal of the capitalist is basically like the conquest and opening of markets eventually, so they can trade, right? That's not very nationalistic, because yeah, the capitalist is more of like a position on making money, on basically kind of being like I mean, I hope I'm not gonna get canceled for this, but yeah, to be kind more of like a supportive, more of like a mercantile like ideology, kind of look of a mercantile kind of program for his nation. But it's not very nationalist. I mean, if you look at like how capitalism functions, it's more like internationalist than anything else. And even if we have to say that like nationalism stereotypically invents itself in 1848, there were a lot of nationalists within 1848 who didn't support the bourgeoisie. They were against the capitalists, if you want. Yeah, and even afterwards, like in future nationalist uprisings, a lot of the nationalists had like a very strong anti-capitalist message. An example that comes to mind, just randomly like that, is the Mexican Revolution of 1910. You can look at people like Emiliano Zapata, for example, even the Flores Magon brothers. A lot of them held like an agrarian socialist position, and also had like somewhat of an indigenous nationalist position. I'm just throwing it. I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, you do with this information whatever you want. I mean, I'm just throwing it out there.
Answer the national question in a way that is truly liberatory, which he found was regional autonomy. As a result, the USSR created.
Well, and eventually for left-wing nationalists, autonomy is not enough. What we want is independence, because we want to be masters of our own destiny. See, if like so basically what she's explaining is basically that Stalin was no different than Kerensky. Is that Kerensky, who basically like had like to negotiate with all these like various parties of like the various colonies of the USSR, of sorry, the Russian Empire, sorry, um, basically had to negotiate, and he had come up to the negotiations that all these like national like leaders who wanted independence had to like subside for autonomy. Okay, once Kerensky gets ousted, everyone basically says, okay, the Russian Empire is collapsing at this point. Like, we just need to become like nation states at this point. We just need to become like states of our own thing and follow our own destiny. Because we, because yeah, why should we bow down, and why should we still continue to maintain like a union with Russia if they're not even willing to respect our own like a national more like national interest or so on, or how we want to run like our territory. Because like a more like an autonomous thing is that it's very easy for like autonomists to become centralists. um, and if they do become centralists, then you can completely forget the idea of like forging your own kind of like system. And if you bring up an analysis of saying, but look, I live I yeah, we live here in country X, and this is how our culture was formed, this is what our culture looks like. And so a program or a national program for such a country would be eventually like the ideal, because it'd be much more compatible and easier to kind of organize, and it's also something that like the people can understand. It's also something that the people can understand. It's made for them. They kind of identify with it. So yeah, might as well just have like that kind of position. While an autonomist, like, yeah, the autonomy can easily like abruptly end like that, as long when the autonomous becomes like a massive centralist, which by the way happened in the USSR.
The Soviet on nationalities, a literal body of government for representation for ethnic groups to set Soviet policies. Likewise, Ukrainian.
Yes. The indigenization period, which again I'm sounding like a parrot right now, but yeah, the indigenization policy, which was completely removed when Stalin comes to power.
Bolshevik Mykola Skripnik forged and implemented Ukrainianization or indigenization.
And most of us have like a positive view of Mykola Skripnik because of the paving of Ukrainization. The problem is, again, Mykola Skripnik, while forging that Ukrainization, he saw his own policies getting removed when Stalin gets to power, and had to and the only way to protest, because he thought that it was gonna make like some form of like importance, like paradigm, or an important phenomenon, is by blowing his brains out. Without realizing that he was actually self-purging himself.
Policies that promoted ethnic Ukrainians and non-Russians to positions of power, set up Ukrainian language schools, and emphasize cultural celebrations in a way to incorporate each national group into the revolutionary socialist project. But now
completely positive, like Ukrainization, the forming of like Ukrainian institutions and so on. That's completely positive. But what was that all made for? Because by the end of the day, that Ukrainization policy was completely like reversed when Stalin comes to power. So I'm asking for all of this in vain.
Nationalists also took advantage of these institutions to hijack the Soviet project. For example, the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, which later merged into the OUN, met as a secret.
Yeah, the Union of Liberation for Ukraine was a socialist organization, by the way.
Society that pretended to be communists to obtain positions of power in these.
They didn't pretend. They were genuinely socialists.
Institutions, and worked to spread Ukrainian nationalist propaganda.
Same for the OUN Pezuz in Bukovina. It was formed by Ukrainian socialists who actually formed itself as a self-defense group against the Romanian authorities, which were attacking Ukrainian institutions.
Similarly, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church was later hijacked by nationalists when it was.
That's not exactly true, because the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church, at that point, I mean, wait, hold on. She's talking about that because, again, like she's throwing so much. Yeah, she's throwing like various facts which sometimes intermixes itself. But no, I mean, in the Ukrainian SSR, like there was no branch of the OUN within the Ukrainian SSR. And if we're talking about Western Ukraine, Sheptytsky was against the OUN. Yeah, Metropolite Andrei Sheptytsky actually saw the OUN as terrorists, which basically were souring positions with the Polish government, which could be swayed and negotiated with to be nicer to the national minorities. Andrei Sheptetsky even has like a letter condemning the actions of the OUN. It was basically like it was a reaction to an assassination of a Ukrainian person actually, who was actually like the director of I think yeah, the director of like an institution. And I mean, the OUN killed killed like some people that they saw as like collaborators with Poland, but the church, yeah, Andrei Sheptetsky was against the OUN, like genuinely. Now, sure, someone might say, but Andrei Sheptetsky actually like welcomed the formation of the Ukrainian state by Stetsko. Yeah, okay, but well, that's true. I'm not gonna say that that isn't true. However, he basically supported it because he himself supported as well the statehood project. So as long as whoever else, I mean, I'm pretty sure that if a left-wing nationalist within like Western Ukraine basically like made a state, he probably would support the statehood as well. But eventually, yeah, by the end of the day, by the end of the day, yeah, I mean, the church was pretty much like against the OUN. Now, there might have been like individual priests who might have supported like the OUN here and there, but that wasn't a majority, and they didn't really have like much of a say. Like people could make up their own mind. Like,
created by the Soviets. These nationalist movements in Ukraine were created by the economic elite like the intelligentsia and the kulak class.
Again, give me names. Who were these elites who were forming the OUN? Again, like the only elite that I could give you is Dmitro Donsov, but Dmitro Donsov was already ideologically an integrist nationalist. So it's not made out of money purposes, it's made out of ideology. It's not made because of capitalism. Like again, like give me these names. Who are these intellectuals who are giving free money to the OUN? I want names. The people want names. Again, like the people want names. We want names. We want names.
And the bourgeoisie to overthrow the Ukrainian worker state. What this proved to the Bolsheviks is
overthrow the Ukrainian worker state. Again, in the Ukrainian SSR, again, there was like a whole like lobby of Ukrainian nationalists who were like left wing and so on, and who actually even support like the idea of communism, who basically wanted the Ukrainization to continue. They wanted like the continuing struggle for for basically Ukrainization policies, and all of them got fucking killed. All of them got murdered. They got purged. Some of them even self-purged because they were protesting certain harsh policies which were made by Stalin. But eventually, yeah, it's convenient for the Marxist-Leninists to say, "Oh well, if you go against like if you go against the you know, the great comrade X who's basically like doing Marxist-Leninism, then by default you are the enemy of the state and you deserve to be purged." I mean, it's kind of like this position. It's kind of like a dialogue of deaf people. Is one will say one might bring up the points, one might have a counter, but it's going to fall on deaf ears. That's kind of like my worry with with any form of Marxist reaction to this particular stream if they ever see this. But yeah.
To resist the nationalist bourgeoisie in Ukraine, they needed to construct
what nationalist bourgeoisie in Ukraine? There was no nationalist bourgeoisie in Ukraine. Sure, there were like intellectuals, but most of the intellectuals were actually like pretty populist. Like the and again also for like the ultimate like bourgeoisie in Ukraine, Ukraine must have been like a very industrialist state, which Ukraine was not. Ukraine was a peasant agrarian state. Even in Western Ukraine, the majority of the population within Western Ukraine, which was under Austro-Hungary, were peasants. Even people like, I mean, if you read like books like Borislav Laughs by Ivan Franko, the book explains to you that most of the peasantry, they didn't like this industrialization thing because it was very exploitative of the Ukrainian peasant. They really did not like it. And same, like a lot of Ukrainian socialists basically had like the ultimate critique of Marx was saying, but what you're supporting is basically like harsh exploitation of the people for them to gain class consciousness and so on to then make the revolution. However, the peasants had like a format and sometimes actually made communes, agrarian communes, where they were already living sort of a communist lifestyle. And basically like, yeah, so all of these agrarian populists were saying, we already have like communism. What we need to do is like make an agrarian revolution, and communism we will have it. We don't need that industrial faction, because the industrial faction, that's a foreign process. It's happening in England, it's happening in Germany, it's happening in France. But these are like too foreign for us. These are foreign systems. We don't identify with this system. Not to mention it's very exploitative. We don't want to live under exploitation. What we want is already get to the socialist part.
Construct a revolutionary inclusive identity that could not be hijacked by nationalists. Thus, socialist patriotism.
But I mean, the term hijack is very strong, because there were already like nationalists pushing for Ukrainization within the Ukrainian SSR. Even people like Vasil Shakrai's whole program was based on Ukrainization, and he was pretty much like a communist. He was still a Marxist at that point. He was still like a Marxist at that point too, because I have an analysis. If Shakrai didn't get like killed by the whites, I think he would have progressively not been like a Marxist socialist. He would still be a socialist, but not a Marxist one. He probably would have been more of a Drahomanovite or something. But eventually, yeah, I mean, Shakrai's whole position, who was a socialist communist, he said, no, we need to like, continue to support like the Ukrainian endeavor of forming like an identity. We have to fight for statehood. We have to fight for our culture and so on. And we need to bring like a Ukrainian cultural system. And eventually, it's the cultural system that will bring upon like a Ukrainian socialism, that will bring the path to Ukrainian socialism and so on. So there was a need for hijacking, because most of the Ukrainian communists already were nationalists.
Patriotism for the Soviet identity. This is not an attack on any national or ethnic group, nor were any languages banned. Before a union of 16 countries,
yeah, and again, when Stalin comes to power, all the indigenization policies, however, just disappear.
They did need a uniform language so that they can all communicate with another, and Russian was the obvious choice for historical reasons.
Yeah, in the beginning, yeah, I agree. In the beginning, yeah, like most of cadres actually knew Russian and so on. But by 1944, 1945, everyone just magically started speaking Russian.
Reasons, as so many people already spoke Russian. It was only institutions that were written with.
Hold on. In the cities, maybe. In the countryside, though. And I also have like a source on this, is that there's a book on like a Ukrainian feminist organization called the Union of Ukrainian Women, which was like this organization formed in the 19th century. Still existed kind of the 20th century. They had branches in the Ukrainian SSR as well, and there was actually like a writing of it where basically like there was a contrast between the Russian feminist version in Ukraine and the Ukrainian feminists, is that when they would go see the peasant women and trying to basically learn them stuff, the Ukrainian peasant women would not understand a single thing the Russian feminist, Soviet feminists would basically like start explaining, and they would actually be they would not be very supportive of it. They would actually try to flee it. But when the feminists of the Ukrainian Women's Union came to the Ukrainian peasantry, then the Ukrainian peasant women would basically completely support the Ukrainian Women's Union. And unfortunately, what happens to the Ukrainian Women's branch to the Union of Ukrainian Women in the USSR? Well, they get purged. I mean, so do the Soviet feminists as well, because Stalin had like another position on feminism. He wasn't exactly like he saw kind of feminism as kind of like bourgeois. So from his perspective, like all feminist unions in the USSR kind of disappeared. But I mean, the Ukrainian feminist unions were actually like also kind of like a pillar of Ukrainization, if you want.
National socialists that were cracked down upon, and not to target the Ukrainian identity.
Again, there were no national socialists in the Soviet Union. Like in the Ukrainian SSR, like there were no own branch in the Ukrainian SSR at that point. Like the only places they existed were Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. And in Romania, they formed pretty late.
Identity or language, but an ideological class war against the nationalist bourgeoisie.
The nationalist bourgeoisie that did not exist on the territory. So what were you fighting against exactly? You were just fighting. Yeah, it was just like a massive purge. It was not an ideological. I mean, yeah, it was an ideological class. It was an ideological war in the sense that basically, like, what had to be supported was the Marxist-Leninist line, and basically what they wanted to do is get rid of the opposition, get rid of the deviations, get rid of the more like left-wing nationalist position. Basically, that's what happened.
Nationalists purposefully conflate what is class war against the bourgeoisie and kulaks into an ethnic genocide.
I mean, again, what kulaks? Like again, like this idea, and again, I mean, I've seen like sources that showed also that like apparently the term kulak is a Tsarist invention. It's basically that kulaks were not exactly like a real thing, but the Tsarists eventually, to pretend that there was like some form of agrarian development, had to basically like create a sort of new class and said, oh look, well the peasants are doing well, so we're just gonna call them kulaks. And eventually a lot of socialists basically bought into this rhetoric that there was like this new emerging class. But apparently like it was a complete like Tsarist fabrication. It was a complete like fabrication by Stolypin and the Russian authorities.
But the Soviets were far more supportive of national minorities than nationalists could ever even pretend to be.
Yeah, tell that to the So nothing happened in the 1930s. Apparently, we're living in this world where apparently like the Great Purge never happened. Oh, it's insane.
Follow Midwestern Marx for the latest news, history content, and Marxist theory. As always, fuck NATO. Welcome to Debunking Ukrainian Nationalism.
Again,
this is a
glitches.
series
I
that will
apologize
study
for the
and
glitch. I
debunk
don't
the
know what
myths
this
of
happened.
Ukrainian nationalist.
Hold on, let's see if there are some. Okay, so episode 7. Hey, we're almost done. Oh man, 3 more videos, man. 3 more videos, and then we're done.
Welcome to Debunking Ukrainian Nationalism. This is a series that will study and debunk the myths of Ukrainian nationalist
Why is the audio so low?
propaganda that are all around us today. So by now, I'm sure you're wondering, why haven't we addressed the elephant in the room? Holodomor. The events that have now been coined as Holodomor are extremely controversial and quite contested by historians.
You don't say.
But it is clear that Ukrainian nationalists and Western governments have chosen their position. Holodomor is a Soviet-initiated genocide. Today, 17 countries around the world recognize Holodomor as a genocide. So first, let's talk about what a genocide is. According to the United Nations, the international legal definition of a genocide is any acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So the hegemon.
And of course, the thing is that like, of course, like since the Holodomor happened before the definition could ever be put in place, was ever put in place by the UN. Eventually, yes, there are some people who could jump on the train and say the Holodomor was a genocide. However, since I actually have sources to claim what I'm saying now, I'm not necessarily going to get into the question of whether or not the Holodomor is a genocide. That's a whole entire conversation for another day. I'm not in the mood to do that right now. But maybe I could explain why Ukrainians might see it as a genocide. And we need to put things into context. Things that like a lot of Marxist-Leninists don't like to do is basically put Holodomor within its historical context. Because again, like there's a reason why there wasn't a talk of like the 1930s, or basically like even like an acknowledgement of like the Great Purge, and that's maybe one of the reasons why. But let's continue and see where this goes.
The hegemonic narrative is that Ukrainians were targeted by the Soviet government to erase the Ukrainian people through starvation, purges, and executions. Now, we will not deny that.
Well, which you can't deny that it didn't happen though, because there's a lot of sources that show that it did happen.
There was a famine in Ukraine in the early 30s. But what is to be examined is whether.
But do you also acknowledge that also the indigenization policies were also reversed, and that the Great Purge happened also? Do you acknowledge that?
Not the economic policies that were implemented were set out to starve Ukrainian people. But before we can dive into that, let's talk about the rise of the Holodomor campaign. Prior to 1970, Holodomor was hardly
about the subject in hand. Why do you need to deviate?
Of in the West or even in Ukraine. In fact, it wasn't until the late 1980s that the term Holodomor was used to describe the famine. So what happened? Well, Ukrainian nationalists in North America were beginning to become infuriated as they felt that the Ukrainian identity was starting to develop this stereotype of Nazi collaborator.
Well, hold on. I mean, source? Do you have a source for that?
70s and the 80s saw a wave of media showcasing Ukrainian nationalists' role in the Holocaust. For instance, in 1977, Ukrainian-American John Demyanuk was arrested and later.
Look, I'm not denying that there weren't like any like Ukrainian nationalists that partook in the Holocaust and stuff in the Shoah by bullet. But the thing is that like, again, to say like, yeah, I mean, the percentages of whoever like did this, I'm not denying that it didn't happen, but to say that all the Ukrainian nationalists like fucking just joined in and just like started like killing everybody left and right is just like it's not true. Like again, there were like people who were against the Nazis within the OUN. I have to repeat myself constantly.
Later convicted in Israel for allegedly having worked in a death camp. In 1975,
Yeah, and I think
Lucy
it was from,
Davidovich's The War Against the
forget
Jew
who
was
was
later
sponsored.
released, which revealed how Ukrainian nationalists partook in the genocide against Jews.
Yeah,
And then in
there were some, yeah, I'm not
1978, the
denying that there were.
miniseries Holocaust aired, which also accurately depicted Ukrainian nationalists' role in the Holocaust. Well, Ukrainian North Americans did not want the crimes of their parents revealed, so in 1982, they launched the campaign to formally recognize the Ukrainian Holocaust, casting it as a deliberate genocide
Ukrainian
perpetuated by the
Holocaust.
Soviets.
Literally no one, apart from, I never heard like anyone outside of Marxist-Leninists like trying to make an association saying, oh well, you see, the Holodomor is called Holodomor because it's supposed to like mimic the Holocaust. Outside of Marxist-Leninist circles, I've never heard anyone else say it. Like so I mean, I don't know. I mean, even the numbers aren't like that. I mean, because yeah, there's like technically speaking, there's like official figures found. It's like above 4 million. So 4 million Ukrainians starved. But eventually, some people would say that there might be estimated higher perspectives, but they prefer like to curve it down to 4 million. But that's again like that's a whole semantic conversation.
Soviet government. Initially, they claimed that 7 million Ukrainians were deliberately starved out by Stalin. Remember
but,
when I
I mean,
said that
the
the
consensus
nationalists
of this
largely came
has
from the Ukrainian
changed.
intelligentsia? Well, in
Even Ukrainians
1983, Ukrainian Canadian veterans of the Waffen SS Galicia Division campaigned and even published scholarly articles on Holodomor.
That's not exactly true. You also had like Ukrainian sources within the immigrants who also talked about the Holodomor, who did say that it could be seen as like national destruction or destruction of the national state. Yeah, Ukrainian sources. There are Ukrainian there were Ukrainian sources who even debunked like Tolstoy's book, who said that it was just like nothing more than just an ideologue book. Yeah.
Some veterans served on the board of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and another served as the chancellor of.
It'd be so nice. I mean, I'm not denying that it might be true. I just want names. Can you please give me names? Give me like sources. Give me like names of these people. The people want names.
The University at Alberta. Even Stepan Bandera's son, Andriy Bandera, bumped the number of victims up from 7 million to 15 million in the OUNB published book Hominy Ukraine. That Holodomor as a genocide was a campaign launched in North America and exported around the world. Its notoriety in the West and in Ukraine is literally rooted in Holocaust apologies. Now just
No. No, because again, even like socialists like actually contributed to, you could say, the Holodomor campaign. There are socialists who basically like debunked a lot of like bullshit that was made by Marxist Leninists, and who said, "Nah, that's not exactly true." And you could actually see, if you put it into its context, you could probably see why Ukrainians could see it as a genocide.
like and watch the next part so we can dive into what really happened during the events known as Holodomor.
Oh boy.
One of the sad realities.
Shit.
Welcome to Debunking Ukrainian National. One of the sad realities of
Bulgaria recently. Yeah, I saw it. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah. Yeah, I saw that. Like a lot of I think there was even like talks of like certain African countries like actually like debating whether or not they should recognize the Holodomor as genocide. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting phenomenon, like this whole war in the whole like war in Ukraine also like made an entire international kind of phenomenon of like looking at Ukraine with a more like analytic view, which is pretty interesting. But yeah. So yeah, but yeah, I mean MLs, man, MLs. But anywho, let's get to the let's end the Holodomor part of the series, and we'll see what because we're almost done. But man, this is a struggle. I'm not gonna lie. This is like a massive struggle.
One of the sad realities of scholarly study on Holodomor is that many of its pioneers reference Ukrainian nationalist academic articles as evidence, but the arguments of these articles are purely presumptuous, with no concrete evidence to support them. This is painted by Western governments and Ukrainians as a widely accepted fact, but the reality is—
Hold on, because there are sources here and there. The problem is that, yeah, there are, I mean, the thing is that there's a massive contrast, because Ukrainian Soviet sources are opened, so you can like so for any scholar that wants to actually study this, you can go to Ukraine and actually like look at the archives, Soviet archives within Ukraine. Russia, however, while they had it opened for a while, right now they reclosed the source, the archives. So you can't really do like much free research more on this topic again. Um, yeah, because there's just like a conflating like kind of yeah, because you have two different archives that are they're kind of like also fighting between each other. The Ukrainian archive is open, so you can go into the Soviet archives and look at it. Russian archives though completely closed now.
Is that scholars who study Holodomor continue to debate the events. So let's talk
Yeah,
about
I
what
don't
happened
deny
during
that.
the events known as Holodomor, addressing the famine first. Welcome to Debunking Ukrainian Nationalism. This is a series that will study and debunk the myths behind Ukrainian nationalist propaganda. So Holodomor refers to the 1933 famine in Ukraine, which is said by Ukrainian nationalists to be a deliberate attempt to exterminate the Ukrainian people.
Again, if you put it in its context with the complete reversal of the indigenization policies and the Great Purge of the 30s, as well as an attack on on basically also like literary circles, which was also a guiding light of the Ukrainian of the Ukrainization phenomenon. Yeah, Ukrainians could probably like see it as a form of genocide against them. Like again, like I'm not gonna get into this debate today because it's yeah, I'm not in the mood to do this on like some yeah against like some 2 minute TikTok video. But but technically speaking, yeah, if you put it into its context, you could possibly you can make that you can make the conclusion that the Holodomor could be kind of seen as a genocide.
famine in Ukraine is without a doubt a tragic loss of life.
Even the Kazakhs like view their famine as a genocide, and the Kazakhs have like less yeah has like I think their death toll is like 1.5 to 2 million because technically speaking the population which was targeted by the Soviet government in Kazakhstan was actually the nomads because they were seen as like a hindrance to industrialization. So in Stalin's position, the nomads had to go. How do I know this? Because there's an article written by Kazakh scholars. It's basically about like a national communist figure called Sultanbek Khorshunov. He actually wanted to, and Khorshounov's whole position when he was like in the Kazakh Soviet government in the late 20s, early 30s, was that he was massively defending the right of nomads to exist. And basically, when the famine started happening, he basically kind of saw that the nomads were not receiving any help. So he kind of said, that, well, and when he tried to basically help the nomads, he was saying that you can't do that because basically the Soviet government saw those nomads as nothing more than a hindrance to industrialization, to basically like Marxist Leninist initiative programs and so on to bring up the 5 year plan. And funnily enough, Khorshunov afterwards would leave Kazakhstan and he would actually serve for a little while in the Ukrainian Soviet government with the National Communists in Ukraine until he got purged, that is. Until everyone
But it
got
was
purged
at no
within the
point
walls.
a man-made or conscious attempt of genocide on the Ukrainian people, but rather a result of unbreakable contracts, natural disasters, and class warfare on
What unbreakable contracts? Like the Soviets didn't know what the hell they were doing. They were technically already trying to do this during the civil war, especially during the War of Independence in Ukraine. And the sources that I have for this is the book Borojbism by Ivan Maestrenko. Basically, Borojbism is like, if you want, like a memoir of that period. So Maestrenko's recollection was basically at one point they were like in a village, and Bolshevik troops were there. And basically, the Bolshevik troops had given like orders for basically like producing basically such a specific number of wheat by the peasants, and were given like a short span of time to do so. And even when the peasants could not achieve like the goal um, of the said number within the decrees and so on, the Bolsheviks would just hoard everything. And the peasants would say, well, hold on, what are you doing? We're not done producing and so on. And the Bolsheviks said, we don't care. We're just going to take everything because it's for the war effort. And yeah, a lot of the Borodjbis actually got disillusioned with the Bolsheviks at that point because they were not respecting the peasants. They didn't know anything about the peasantry. They know how, yeah, they didn't even know how like a normal peasant like functioned. They didn't understand how a village like functioned or how like agrarian work actually worked. Shit, what I do? Like
Man-made or conscious attempt of genocide on the Ukrainian people, but rather a result of unbreakable contracts, natural disasters, and class warfare on the
even natural disasters, like natural disasters didn't even like contribute. I mean, I know that there was like I think I read that there was like a drought, a small drought in southern Ukraine, but I mean the thing is that the Holodomor mainly touched like eastern parts of Ukraine. So yeah, and even so, even with the drought within southern Ukraine, it didn't really touch like production efforts. Like the thing is that like yeah, because people like also to say that like yeah, catastrophes or natural catastrophes like hindered also like the production of wheat and so on. That's not exactly true. Apparently, it was a pretty good harvest that year. And there's a lot of scholars that actually there are some scholars and some studies that have basically like analyzed the harvest of that year, and a lot of them came to the conclusion that it was a pretty much like a pretty good harvest.
wealthy oppressors. We must also define kulaks as they are the center of the story. Kulak refers to an economic class that were wealthy peasants who often
Yeah, an economic class created and completely invented in a newspaper article by Stolypin and the Tsarist authorities, which basically the first draft of the Bolsheviks blindly believed existed, without actually investigating the villages themselves for this phenomenon.
had their own employees and financially benefited from the exploitation of poor peasants.
Hold on, you know that when peasants had like hectares of certain like big hectares of land. I mean, the thing is that they didn't really exploit other peasants. They were mainly like working alongside them. Like even like the employers of the peasants within like big farmers, they would sometimes do the yeah they would no not sometimes they would actually often work alongside the other peasants for mass production for like the production of wheat and so on. Like again, this is something that like this is why I constantly say to MLs, I ask them, have you ever worked on like a farm and so on? Have you actually talked to like an agrarian worker? Because it's not as simple as you think. It's not exactly as black and white as you think. It's a very complicated process.
Naturally, kulaks were against the Soviet government, which was a state led by the proletariat and poor
Peasants in general were against the Soviet government because the Soviets were not respecting the peasants.
peasants. Kulaks had numerous revolts and often collaborated with the nationalists and czarists to overthrow the worker state. As a result, they were
Tsars maybe in Russia. In Ukraine, yeah, they preferred like yeah, they supported people like yeah, more of the Ukraine, yeah, the Ukraine People's Republic. Let's mention it again. Khrushchevsky like emancipated the peasants. Venichenko also like supported emancipating the peasants. Even Petlura, like yeah, the whole like process of fighting against like Skoropadsky back in 1918. Uh, the entire peasantry supported like Petlura's coup against Skoropadsky because Skoropadsky was bringing back serfdom.
seen as enemies of the proletariat. To understand the Soviet view on kulaks, we can look to the 1918 published Comrades, Workers, Forward to the Last, Decisive Fight, written by Lenin, in which he states the class-conscious workers program is the closest
Fortunately, it's glitching, so I have to enlarge the screen and try to see if I can find the date. Apparently not. Well, but again, I'm imagining it's before like the revolution.
alliance and complete unity with poor peasants, concessions to an agreement with the middle peasants, ruthless
Yeah, again, so a written pamphlet which basically completely contradicts itself with the actions taken by the Soviet government. I mean, I mean it's yeah again like Lenin's literature is nice. I've read like Lenin before. It's very nice. It's very nice. But like again, when he gets into power, he does completely different things.
suppression of the kulaks, those bloodsuckers, vampires, plunderers of the people, and profiteers who batten on famine. That is the policy of the working class. The Soviets sought to eliminate serfdom and kulaks as a class as they were a holdover of the feudal society, and the USSR needed industrialization to bring their agriculture to modern times. To eliminate the class, the Soviets
Yeah, that's not understanding how how basically like how basically industrialization functions and so on. Especially not understanding how basically like a village functions and so on. You can't just give like a massive like a massive number of production to be made by peasants in a short span of time. Because that's again that's what happened during the Holodomor is that a lot of like the Soviet officials went to peasants. They would give them like an astronomical number of sources to do, in like a very short span of time. And when they weren't complete, even when they haven't attained like production levels, they just take everything and basically say, well, good luck, but this is for the industrialization effort and so on. Like Jesus.
It's created the Committee of Poor Peasants, which had appropriated millions of acres of formerly owned kulak land, and it socialized the land into kolkhozes, or farming cooperatives. Land itself was already nationalized in the
We
U.S.
took it from big Mennonite landowners mainly. Mennonites, I mean, Mennonites is a whole different story, but yeah, like most of those lands were technically like taken back from like a wealthy Mennonites who basically didn't really live a Mennonite lifestyle, um, and were basically like collectivized. Yeah, Mennonites living in Ukraine and Belarus mainly, Belarus and also Russia. I can't speak for other places of the USSR because I just don't know the situation. Like, yeah, what happened in say like I don't know Dagestan. I don't know if there's like Dagestanis who are going to watch the stream. Please contribute to the conversation. Um, what was the agrarian policy under like the Free Mountainous Republic, and how did it change when it get to like Dagestani to the Soviet Dagestani times? Like, please contribute to the conversation because I genuinely don't know.
USSR, but the workers of the kolkhozes would jointly own shares of production and even elected their own managers. So this began the policy of collectivization, which was set out to modernize and centralize production in the semi-feudal states. But of course, those with material power are not going to relinquish control without a fight. What unfolded in Ukraine was a deliberate class warfare against the worker state and a wealthy elite that sought.
It was not. It was not a class warfare. I mean, come on. The Holodomor happens like precisely, and I want to say also like coincidentally, even though I don't really believe in coincidences, during the complete reversal of the Ukrainization policies, and when basically like antagonisms between various like communist and socialist lines were basically at their highest. I mean, you had like a struggle with like Borodibus people, you had a struggle with more like national communist minded people, and yeah, also like an agrarian socialist minded people. There was like a massive conflict between like the central authorities and these different like socialist agrarians, and not just in Ukraine, but also in Kazakhstan, in Mongolia, which hilariously Mongolia wasn't even like a Soviet republic; it was more of a Soviet vassal state, but it was independent technically speaking. On paper, it was independent. But yeah, Mongolia had like its own version. I mean, yeah, like the purges like touched everybody, and when it came to like the famines, it mainly touched like Kazakhstan and touched Ukraine, but it also touched the Kuban, which had like a big Ukrainian population at that point and had like a lot of Ukrainian institutions there as well, and also what was called like Zhovtay Klinos, which was like kind of like a myriads of Ukrainian populations within the Volga region. So it's pretty interesting why also like the famine also touched like those parts as well, and that also Ukrainization was also touched in those places too. But yeah, of course, like yeah, of course, like Kyla here is not going to touch about upon this either.
Sought to maintain its ability to exploit poor peasants. Like and watch for part 3. Holodomor is a very heavy topic, so let's take an interim break.
Boy. In the Soviet posters, yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that a lot of those Soviet posters, while it was written like in languages and so on, in the national language, um, a lot of it was mainly made by Russians because they just needed to fill like antagonisms and so on. So yeah, and also to kind of pretend to see, oh, well, see, the Ukrainians also like have like support our own line. While even in the 1950s, like after the Second World War ended, you also had like somewhat national communist minded folks which kind of survived, such as people like Sosura, for example, who basically like still agreed and supported like a sort of Ukrainization policy to come back. But yeah, but basically like those Soviet posters, even if you do have like portrayals of like, oh well, you know, oh look, the Ukrainians are happy and so on, it was kind of also hiding like the reality that like the 1950s, 1930s, not so much the 1940s, because 1940s was like a period of war, so eventually massive chaos was blowing. But eventually it was just to hide like massive reality that like Stalin was bringing back like a form of red czarism, if you want. As for yeah, were all the leaders of the UPR left leaning? From Khrushchevsky to Vinnychenko to Petrueva, they were all socialists. Like that's the thing that like a lot of Marxist Leninists don't like to to touch upon, and when they do, they kind of fail because, yeah, I mean, they've never read, like, for example, like Khrushchevsky's works, or even like pamphlets written by Vininchenko. Vininchenko was genuinely like a light Bolshevik, unironically, and he would actually support the endeavors of like the National Communists, and he would make also a group of immigrants, which was the Ukrainian group of communists in exile, where basically they would support they would actually support like a more nationalistic endeavor to fend off against like full-fledged like Russification of Ukrainian lands. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't know what that happens. Like the screen just bugs like insanely. Oh, and to what happened to the Ukrainians living in Kuban? Well, they all got like they all got starved to death. Technically, they all got purged, just like what happened to the Circassians, by the way. The Circassians beforehand, yeah, they got like killed by like the Tsarists, and yeah, then basically like the Ukrainians under the Soviet times, which were forcefully placed after the destruction of the Zaporozhian siege in 1775. The Ukrainians living in the Kuban got like purged by the 30s. The institutions were closed and dismantled. So yeah, so that's kind of why Ukrainians will see the Holodomor as a genocide, because it's not just the famine; it's the entire context surrounding the famine. It's the reversal of the nativization policies, also like the Great Purge, which technically speaking touches on like the various like national communists and more like left wing nationalists and so on, which basically just targets like any form of Ukrainization endeavors, promotion of Ukrainian institutions, promotions of the Ukrainian language and literature and music, and so on and so forth. So yeah, this is why this is why people, at least in Ukraine, Ukrainians will see like the Holodomor as like a genocide, and this is something that like a lot of Marxist Leninists don't want to analyze further. They just want to see, oh well, the material thing is this. Stalin said this. There's nothing about like forcefully taking food and so on. So this means that it can be a genocide. It's a tragedy, but not a genocide. But if you put it like into its context, then it could be seen as a genocide. So hold on, let me just take a sip of water because my throat is starting to tire. And part 9. Oh man.
Holodomor is a very heavy topic, so let's take an interim break.
Well, you can't be less condescending than that. You do like a 2-minute TikTok video about like a super difficult like topic, and you don't even put it like in its context. You do like stuff like that. I mean, come on. Oh man.
Thankfully for us
Then
at
you wonder why
Midwestern
people
Marx,
don't like Marxist.
Ukrainian nationalists are an endless vault of historical revisionism and propaganda that make it very easy for us to create content. We only ask that
Yeah, very bad content with omissions and complete non-understanding of the topics that you're trying to talk about.
you meaningfully engage with this content instead of dismissing all dissent as Russian propaganda.
Well, I mean, I believe you guys are funded by RT, if I'm not mistaken, or at least some of you have associations with RT. So I don't think it's much of I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that it's necessarily Russian propaganda. I mean, maybe not the Soviet stuff because a lot of Russians are also pretty anti-communist, but so that's more. I would say that's more of like an ideologue thing. You're doing this more out of ideology, which I mean I don't know if it's better or worse, but I mean yeah, technically speaking, also when you're trying to debunk like Ukrainian nationalist propaganda, and you do like your first 2 videos, which basically like skip like entire like parts of of Ukrainian history, going from like the Kiev and the Rus all the way to 1917. So you're basically skipping the 12th century. You're basically like taking like the 12th century, and you're just doing like a massive leap forward to 1917 without talking about Galicia, Volhynia, without talking about the Zaporozhian host, what happened after the dissolution of the Zaporozhian host. So that means the Ukrainian, like more of the Ukrainian cultural movements that emerged within the territory of Ukraine under Russian rule, or even in Austro-Hungary, and basically like kind of even the formation and foundation of the various ideas of Ukrainian nationalism. So I mean, no, I'm sorry, but this whole series is god awful. Like How can anyone take this seriously? Like, let's see how many comments this thing has. 119 comments, Jesus. With like 2.1 thousand views. I mean, come on. How can people take this seriously? I mean, I know I watched some of the comments, like I watched some of the comments. Some Ukrainians do see this and they do like try to debunk it, but I mean, it doesn't reach like a lot of people, unfortunately.
But this time, I want to address a point that's largely coming from the Western left. The point that Ukrainian nationalism doesn't give Russia a right to invade Ukraine. Look, it is
Well, I mean, are they wrong?
futile to make moralistic arguments because each side has
I mean, it's so funny she says it's futile to make moralistic arguments. But I mean, you did like your entire position, your entire reason for doing like this video is based on like moralist arguments, saying, oh, but no, there can't be like, hold on, Ukrainians can't hold like this position because it's bad. I mean, yeah, you can have like positions against like say like National Socialism or fascism. At least understand why at least it exists. Don't just for one like a massive like moralistic position. At least understand why it exists and try to like figure out a way to basically kind of like to kind of show the way and say, hey, there's other alternatives that are a bit better, you know. But no, they're not gonna do this. They just want to be like massively condescending and so on.
has their view on what is right and what is wrong. We can only look at facts and
I mean, if man, imagine if this was like debunking like Palestinian nationalism, and she said something like that, supporting the Israeli side or something. Like Jesus, that'd be like a massive shit show.
accept that there will always be contradicting forces at play. What I have sought to explain in these videos is the ideology and the behavior of the Ukrainian far right, starting with the inception of the fascist movement.
I mean, it's nice to say like the Ukrainian far right, but you don't even talk about like the other formations of nationalism which existed. Like the far right didn't just like magically appear like this. Okay, the far right, or at least like or third position, if you want, emerged within the interwar period because of the failures of the Ukrainian left. That's what you don't say, and that's like a massive important thing. But otherwise, people like Yevhen Konovalets was very willing to ally with like the Ukrainian Bolsheviks. He wrote letters to the Ukrainian Soviet government asking for weaponry to try and fend off against like Polish authorities and so on. Which basically Stalin said, no, you're not gonna give weapons to the Ukrainians. But I mean, yeah, like Ukrainian nationalism didn't just like magically emerge like this. At least like the far right or third position like nationalists didn't just like magically just emerge like this. Like there's a reason why it exists, and the reason you don't explain why it exists. That's my whole problem with this series.
And how play a result in what is happening today. The Ukrainian National Socialists have vowed to
Wait, hold on. You really think that like from Ukraine's independence to 2014 that there was like a magic fascist government? Like, please. Ukraine, when it gains independence, becomes more or less like a liberal state. Like, yeah, there were like some. I mean, yeah, eventually when the fall of the Soviet Union fell, you had like pockets of like certain like radical right wing nationalists. But that was ironically formed. Yeah, things like the Una UNSO, for example, ironically formed during the Afghan war, during the Soviet-Afghan war. It was actually made by ex like Ukrainian veterans of the Soviet-Afghan war, which were for the most part like kind of forcefully conscripted, um, and they were actually like formed like some form of like nationalist or like national identity battalions, kind of to kind of stay like within like one rank and kind of say, hey, you're Ukrainian, I'm Ukrainian. Okay, cool. We got like our little club here. And afterwards, yeah, it would form itself like in the 90s, basically, out of that, and they would have like more of like a radical like nationalist position, saying, yeah, we lost like this time on history, so we need to make things right, kind of like a sort of like that kind of variety. But even the Una Unsa also was, which is funny enough, is they had also like um, of their allies, if you want, and say allies, came from like either Nazbol circles or outright like Russian nationalist circles. Like Dmytro Korczynski, for example, was pals with Dugin until Dugin sold him out, for example. I have an article if you want. There's an article that I could throw in the comments like later on. But I think I put it in my community post. If I didn't, I mean, I might do it both. I might put a comment under this stream after I finish this, or I could and I'll put it in like a community post just for people who want to read it can read it.
To eliminate the Russian nation and their success in garnering
I mean, dude, like right now, I mean, back in back in like the 90s, like no one was saying, yeah, we need to destroy the Russian nation. Like no one was saying. Today it's a bit more, yeah. Today, obviously, with the Russian invasion happening for real, yeah, so some Ukrainian nationalists eventually like support like the decolonization of Russia. Um, but the West, if the West supports the decolonization of Russia, not really. I'll tell you why. Because Russia is a nuclear power. If Russia just collapses tomorrow morning, imagine the chaos that would happen. Trust me, you don't want like some I don't know some Buryat warlord having like a nuclear missile in his fucking barracks. Trust me, you don't want that to happen. So the West does not want Russia to collapse. If that's her idea, no. I don't think like Western powers are saying, yeah, we want like Russia to collapse. There might be like some minor people who believe this, but again, these are like minor people which no one have heard of before. And I mean, yeah. And when it comes to like Eastern Europe, well, yeah, obviously, because Eastern Europe has like a very different position on Russia. Like again, like it's parasocial relations between nations. If you don't understand this, then you don't understand geopolitics. I'm sorry, but yeah, the Eastern European, Caucasian, and Central Asians who have like a bad history with the Russians obviously prefer like Russia to kind of go back to like a smaller part, the smaller borders and so on, and of course like nationalists within like the Russian republics, yeah, who kind of feel like oppressed, such as for example the Chechens, yeah, they probably don't really want to live under Russia to begin with.
institutional power via the military, education, church, the executive, and social life pose an existential threat to the Russian nation.
How? What, you really believe? Hold on. How? You really think she really believes that like fucking like Azov Battalion, especially Azov Battalion today, which is not the Azov Battalion of 2014. I know because I have like a book. I put it in the community post. It's called the Azov Battalion. It's in French. I don't know if there's like translations yet, but yeah, it's made by a person who basically like went to Ukraine, or at least yeah, who basically like studied like the Azov Battalion formation and the Ukraine radical movements of Ukraine. Like most of them have intertwined with Russian nationalists before. There are even like Russian hyper nationalists in Russia who are against Putin, who don't like what Putin is doing into Ukraine. They say it's not productive. Now that doesn't mean necessarily supporting them. Their message, I mean, is I mean, I appreciate the message that they're right about Putin not doing anything productive for Russia. But I think everyone can agree that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is not exactly the most greatest thing or the most like greatest thing that ever happened to Russia. But to believe that like some random 200 men battalion is gonna take down the Russian state, I mean, I don't know in what world you're living in, but I mean, yeah, this is not like fucking. This is not like 300. Okay, this is not like Sparta. Like even they can say it. They can say, yeah, we hate Russia and so on, but I don't think they're gonna be ever capable. Even if you did nothing about it, they will never be capable of taking down Russia. Like, come on, by themselves, no, not a chance.
And ethnic Russians in Ukraine.
Okay, this idea that like ethnic Russians are going to be destroyed by like Ukrainian nationalists is completely false. Like number one, like I mean, even the idea that after 2014, like the only thing that happens is they'll say, "Oh, well, it's an attack on the Russian identity." It's not an attack on the Russian identity. There was just a more bigger promotion of Ukrainization. Because why? Because well, a lot of the Ukrainian culture, a lot of the Ukrainian language under Russian rule was pretty much curve stomped, right? So what you want is a more promotion of your cultural identity, if you want. But every country does this. Like why can every country is allowed to do this except Ukraine apparently? Like it's crazy.
If you want an in-depth explanation of the Ukrainian far-right's power today, you can watch my one
I'll just say they're not in power. A Marxist analysis of the oh Jesus, it's a live stream and shit. Do I want to react to this one day? I don't know. I'll make up my mind. But oh man, a 1 hour stream about this. I don't feel no, I don't feel ready today. I'll think about it. Do I react to this? I'll think about it.
hour-long video on Midwestern Marx YouTube. The reality is that Russia, despite pleas from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation of Donetsk,
Okay, hold on. So the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which has no branch in Ukraine, why do they care exactly? Why do they care exactly? That's the ultimate question. Is why is Russia doing this? Because it's not to help out the Russian population in Ukraine. I can tell you this right now. A lot of ethnic Russians have been killed by indiscriminate shelling from Russia right now. So yeah.
of Lugansk,
Yeah, hold on. The communist parties of quote unquote of Luhansk and Donetsk, the quote unquote communist parties, obviously, are nothing more than just like hyper Russian nationalist psyops, really, who are just there to basically they kind of act like they kind of act like the Volksdeutsch in Yugoslavia or in Czechoslovakia. Yeah, kind of like the Sudeten Germans is basically saying, "Oh, we're oppressed and stuff. Come and help us." But in reality, like they just don't want to let go of their influence. Really, a lot of it is that a lot of Russian oligarchs are in that region too, and they don't want to let go of their influence. A lot of Russian channels, for example, which are in Donetsk and Luhansk or just in Donbass, are run by like these various oligarchs. And the oligarchs basically, if those channels were to disappear, for example, they wouldn't make their money. So that's one reason. There's even people like Sergei Aksyonov, who's like the governor of Crimea right now, and he's the guy who basically orchestrated all of this. Like Sergei Aksyonov, basically what happened is that he basically like met with Girkin, and this was prior to like the whole like anti-Maidan thing, the anti-Maidan protest that happened like a bit later after the annexation of Crimea. He met with Girkin to basically start off like these little gay ops in eastern Ukraine, and eventually would just lead to like a full-on like invasion of like FSB troops helping like quote unquote local militias um, to get into Ukraine and just like start the ultimate suck. I mean, yeah,
and Ukraine.
yeah, the Communist Party of Ukraine, which basically were nothing more than just like shills for greater Russian expansion. Like there are way better like respectable like left-wing organizations in Ukraine than the Communist Party of Ukraine, which was nothing more than just which was basically just basically just Russian shells and shit who basically wanted like the greater like Soviet Union to come back. Like Moldova has the same problem. Moldova has like a communist party which basically like supports like basically becoming like part of Russia and shit. Like it's insane. But there are better like yeah, and there are way more respectable like left wing organizations within Ukraine. The National Communist Front, for example, is respectable. Socialny Ruch, which is I think the biggest one, is actually more respectable, and they actually have like a real program. Unlike the Communist Party of Ukraine, God. Yeah, the Communist Party of Ukraine is it's so communist that it allies with ANCAPs, unironically, just because they're that petty against like liberalism. Even though like ANCAPs hilariously are just like liberals who basically just hate the state. Oh man.
To take militaristic power in liberating Donbass, Putin decided against it for 8 years and pursued a path of peace agreements.
Yeah, Minsk Accords 1 and 2, which weren't even respected by the Russian side, by the way. There's even like an entire documentary where they go to Minsk Accords 1 to make the Minsk Accords #1. You have Putin and Poroshenko going to Belarus, and they're there like sitting there for like days and days, and Putin just at one point just comes out and just says to Poroshenko, "I'm gonna destroy your country," and just leaves. Like, hell. Yeah, that was Minsk Accord 1. Minsk Accord 2 didn't even partake. Like, cause I'll tell you why the Russians didn't even respect it. Because one of the points was to basically like retrieve like troops and get them out of the region. The Russians didn't even respect that. They just let the troops continue to exist. So it's insane.
twice, which failed because the
Girkin still stayed in Donetsk and stuff, and he continued like to do military operations and shit.
Ukrainian nationalists launched Operation No Capitulation, Zelensky being pressured.
Because it's so short. The face-to-face confrontation with militants from the Nazi as I don't know where this comes from. The peace initiative called No to Capitulation encountered a wall of obstinacy. I mean, that's nice, but like, why are you getting this? Hold on. NoWarFreedom.org. It sounds like, I don't know, that sounds like a I mean, already, like, yeah, I mean, it's not objective. It's probably not gonna be objective, like, in any way, shape, or form. But this idea that, like, Zelensky made peace with, like, the neo-Nazis, like, the fact of the matter is that the neo-Nazis didn't have, like, any potential bargaining powers. It's just the number one that, like, you're fighting, like, fucking Russian militias, which are run by, like, the FSB and stuff. Like, eventually, yeah, what else was there supposed to do? What can you do, really, in that situation? Oh, man, this is a mess. Not to mention, like, this idea that, like, oh, the neo-Nazis have, like, a grip on Zelensky. Please, if that were true, then, like, most of like what Azov supports would have already been accomplished, which it hasn't.
Operation No Capitulation, Zelensky being pressured by the far-right paramilitaries, vowed to take Crimea and even put troops.
I mean, dude, like, even Poroshenko, like, vowed to take back Crimea. So that's not even like him. That's not even like him necessarily, like, bowing down to the scary neo-Nazis. Even Poroshenko, like, vowed to take back Crimea. Like, come on. Is that, yeah, eventually, yeah, it's true that when Zelensky wanted to get, like, elected, he ran on, like, a peace platform. But the reality is that, yeah, the Russians, yeah, Donetsk and Luhansk basically just didn't maintain their deal. So if you're not gonna maintain your side of the bargain, why should the Ukrainians? I'm just saying, if you're not gonna respect the accords, then what should the other side? I'm just saying.
Closer along the eastern border. It was a clear provocation, and despite international.
How is it a provocation? They're fighting on their land. They're trying to take back their own land. They're not trying to go into Russia. Jesus.
Agreements, he pursued a path of NATO ascension, which was a clear hard.
Hold on. NATO ascension was already, like, supported by. Yeah, I mean, even Yanukovych tried to get, like, NATO ascension. It failed because he acted like a massive clown. There are videos of it too. Because he acted like a massive clown at that summit. But he also tried to, like, to basically have, like, better relations with NATO and stuff. Even to, I mean, yeah, because eventually, like, Midwestern Marx here have never read his program. His program's in PDF. I mean, granted, it's in Ukrainian, but yeah, you could probably translate it easily. But eventually, Yanukovych basically, like, ran on EU integration, and he also even, like, gave lip service to, like, NATO integration. No one had a problem with that. And even so, like, Euromaidan and stuff was not made for NATO. It was made for, like, the EU solely. Like, NATO, no one cared about it.
Red line for Russia. NATO is a terroristic alliance that has plundered countries like Syria, Libya, and Serbia. It is.
I mean, sure, you could probably criticize, like, what happened in Serbia. NATO is not in Syria. There are, like, individual NATO states in Syria, but it's not, like, the entire organization within it. And as for Libya, she's aware that, like, there were some, like, African Union leaders that actually asked for NATO to intervene in Libya, because the thing is that Gaddafi claimed to be, like, the king, once just claimed to be the king of Africa, and certain African leaders had a problem with that. So yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously, like, what NATO did to Libya is disgusting. I'm not gonna sit here and say that, like, it was like a walk in the park. It was massively disgusting, and I don't support it. But I mean, the African Union also has, like, blood on their hands too. I'm just saying.
Is a neo-colonial war machine, and no country, not even Ukraine, has the right to benefit from the devastation of third world countries. Additional.
It's a good thing that it's a good thing they're not, and they weren't.
The far-right paramilitaries have not quit in their campaign to punish and exterminate Donbass people and even escalated on attacks.
Wait, okay, the Alley of Angels. There are sources, I mean, there have been like some stuff found out about the Alley of Angels that some of the kids pictured in the Alley of Angels weren't even like in Donbass. Some of them were even like alive when their picture was put. Yeah, there were reportings of stuff. I mean, I remember like seeing also like I think a sort of interview with like a family of one of the kids which were portrayed on the Alley of Angels who said, "Hold on, our child didn't die in Donbass in 2014. Our child was taken away from like a serial killer in like Novosibirsk and stuff, which is pretty disgusting." So like yeah, I mean dead kids is terrible and stuff, but like I mean the Alley of Angels, a lot of it is used for like propaganda purposes, and they had to like take away like a couple of names because yeah, there were like people, there were like kids on the picture on the Alley of Angels who weren't even in Donbass when they died and stuff, and some kids were even like found alive living in Russia and stuff who weren't even native to Donbass, and also there was no ethnic cleansing of like Russians and so on. That's like a myth. It's like the myth fabricated by like pro-Russian people to basically say, oh, but look, see, the Ukrainian far right has like battalions and so on, which means they're going to exterminate like the Russians and shit. No, the far right battalions formed in reaction to Girkin's invasion of Slovyansk. That's why Azov battalion, for example, like exists.
Acts that killed civilians, namely children. But it was when Zelensky suggested at the Munich Security Conference that Ukraine may seek renuclearization after 8 years of killing.
I mean, at this point, like, yeah, it's a deterrent. I'm not. It's a deterrent. Like Iran, like I'm pretty sure she has no problem with Iran making nuclear weapons to defend against America or something. So why does she have a problem with Ukraine wanting like nukes and stuff to probably have a deterrent and stuff? You need sometimes, yeah, politic demands like a bargaining chip.
Donbass civilians, threatening to invade Russian territory, and joining NATO.
Invading Russian territory. Literally, no one wants to invade Russian territory. Literally no one.
That Putin finally decided to recognize the People's Republics in Donbass. But it was once they were recognized as nations that they...
Oh, I see what she's talking about. Okay. Yeah, because the Ukrainians basically had like a chance to retake like Donbass. And basically like yeah, the MLs right now, the Z-tard MLs basically at this point like view Donbass as like Russian land. You know, like the declaration of independence of like Donbass and Luhansk was a recent phenomenon. And basically, yeah, it was basically considered as like Ukraine land by everybody, and even the Ukrainians consider it as their land. So it's not Russian land.
asked Russia for assistance in the civil war against Ukraine, that Russia may aid them. War is gruesome, and
the war that Russia began when they annexed Crimea and when Girkin attacked Slovyansk.
We should support all peace talks to end civilian casualties. A sad reality of war are abhorrent, and regardless of their views, we don't support senseless death. But the
yeah, sure. I don't believe you.
results of today stem from the nationalist endeavors of the past. They stem from nationalist paramilitaries and Ukrainian state provocation.
No, which were formed as self-defense units when Girkin invaded Slovyansk. Again, I don't know why you rejected Girkin. He was like your best commander too. I don't like Girkin, but even I have to say he was like your only like good military strategist. Now he's in jail.
At the expense of their people. If you claim to support the Ukrainian people, then you should support peace talks and the denazification of Ukraine.
Well, we support peace. The thing is that Russia does not want peace. Like they've openly said that like Ukraine doesn't exist and needs to be destroyed. So why would Ukrainians like support peace right now when you have like a hostile nation basically using the propaganda referencing, yeah, Ukraine's not a real state and stuff, and it's always been Russia. It needs to belong to us and stuff. I'm sorry, but the Ukrainians at this point like are fighting an existential war. And oh, fight the Nazis. I mean, listen, if you support Baathism, if you support like Hamas, you and if you support Hezbollah, um, stop crying about like third position battalions in like Eastern Europe or some stuff like that because it just makes you look like a massive hypocrite. Yeah, or just plainly stupid. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, they will never mention. Yeah, it's insane. Like all the stuff they say. I mean, I bring this up sometimes to them. I say, hold on, you have like Rusich Battalion. You got like the Order of Nine Angles. You have even like foreign volunteer battalions from other European countries. Like there was like Golden Dawn at one point fighting for the Russians. They had Casa Pound. They had the Nordic Resistance Movement and so on. And they say, oh, but these aren't like important and so on. These are okay, even though like I think it's the Russian Imperial Movement which gets like training and weapons from the Russian government and stuff. Even like people from like the movement of national unity, which is like this third position esoteric Hitlerist like Russian organization. Its leader is literally in the United Russia. He's like a pal of Putin and shit. It's insane. Oh man, yeah, yeah. The brain cells are just dying. It's a good thing it's the last video after this. So this is the last video, and I'm calling it a day because man, aren't the party branches in the occupied Donbas regions former CPU branches? Technically speaking, yeah, they are. It's just yeah, they rebranded themselves as like Donbass and Luhansk because they LARP is like independent. But yeah, technically speaking, yeah, they're just like the regional branch of the Communist Party of Ukraine. Oh, there's no problem. I mean, yeah, no, there's no problem. I mean, I'm glad to answer any of the questions asked here. Like, so yeah, eventually, yeah, for education purposes, it's important. Also because it debunks like all this like Russian Zyokon propaganda, which I've been seeing for like the last what 9 years now, 9, 10 years now. Yeah, 10 years basically. Wow, we're getting there. So yeah, it's going to. So yeah. Anywho, let's get to this last video. Last video. It's the last line.
What is the best way to end the war in Ukraine and finally find peace on Earth?
Oh, yeah,
well, it's
please tell me.
obviously to keep sending weapons and money to Ukraine until they can win, right? No, the answer to ending war is not to continue funding it. Welcome to Debunking.
Hey, just replace Ukraine with Palestine. I'm just saying, just replace Ukraine with Palestine. How to stop like Palestine the Palestine-Israeli conflict is not to give more like support for Palestinians and support their right to exist. No, it's to force them to like a peace negotiation table where you have people who basically do not see Palestine as like a real thing and don't even support like a basic like either two-state solution or somewhat of a pan-Semitic state, depending on where you're on the aisle. And who basically just support like continuing like settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. Oh man.
Ukrainian nationalism. This is a series that will study and debunk the myths behind Ukrainian nationalist propaganda that is all around us today. Let me just say, there is nothing like the will of a people struggling for national liberation. They will give themselves entirely for their freedom, and they
Also, now you acknowledge that it's for national liberation. It took 10 videos, guys. It took 10 videos. I can't.
there is absolutely beauty in that. The issue with this for the Ukrainian national liberation struggle is that their tactics and ideology are one that is very parallel to Germany's tactics of 1930s. Both
What? Hold on. Literally, the Russians are using the ethno-nationalist argument, and are basically copying like are taking a page out of like the NSDAP's playbook by saying we got like our fucking ethnic minorities getting like attacked by Ukrainians. Like, come on. Like, listen. I mean, I'm not the kind of guy to compare like Putin to Hitler. For me, Putin is more of like a bad Pinochet. But come on, like they've taken like literally the page of like the NSDAP's playbook of like fighting for like the ethno-nationalist like argument saying we need to defend our ethnic minorities in country X or Y. Like, Jesus.
had seen themselves as oppressed and exploited. In both cases, they were, by the West. In both of
Sure, Ukraine exploited by the West, knowing that the Ukrainian Western the relations between Ukraine and the West don't begin before 1991. Think about that one.
In these cases, nationalism gripped the country, and the people there saw themselves not as aggressors, but as subjugated nations fighting for their dignity. In both of these cases, nationalism was also
No, we're fighting. I mean, listen, before the whole like 2014 debacle, like technically speaking, like there was normalization of relations with Russia. Like Ukraine didn't send, for example, didn't recognize Chechnya as like an independent state. There were nationalist battalions that went to help the Chechens, um, yeah, to help the Chechens independently and so on. Like the UNO so, for example, went to fight on the Chechen side. Um, Look, they didn't really make much of a commotion when the ethnic conflicts in Georgia began, even if there were UNO UNSO fighting on the Georgian side, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I don't understand like this argument.
greatly repelled by sections of the working class who would find themselves being persecuted or worse, executed. And the
The working class, I mean, most of the working class, I'm just saying, like, most of the working class right now supports the KVPU, which is the biggest union in Ukraine, and which has been banned by the DPR and LPR. So yeah, there's a lot of working class folks, unionist folks, who are fighting for their country against the Russians since 2014 too. If you want like more like articles on this and stuff, there's a site called Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, which has actually like done interviews with like unionists from Ukraine and so on, and who basically like kind of explain to you that Donbass and the DPR and LPR are not exactly the workers' paradise that they pretend to be.
nationalists of both these countries have advocated for the extermination of the Russian people, and as
No, they haven't. What they want is to expel the Russian troops that came on Ukrainian territory. Maybe expel also the collaborators, but to exterminate them? No. I mean, maybe there are like some loons there, but yeah, there might be like some loons, you might say, but it's not a majority.
As a result, both have seen the Russian bear say, F around and find out. As the war escalates,
Except the Russian bear is the one that fucked around.
many are calling for concessions and peace agreements to be made. Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian
I mean, what concessions do you have with a state that doesn't even recognize you as like a real country and who says your culture doesn't exist and so on? What concessions can you have with like these kinds of people? I'm just genuinely asking. Like, I'm willing to find solutions, but how can you find like peace negotiations and so on with like people like Putin who says, "Oh, well, Ukraine's not a real state. Ukraine's not a real nation. Ukraine people don't exist. They're just like Russians with like an identity crisis and so on." Like, yeah, how the hell do you like find peace and consensus with these people? Like, I'm genuinely asking.
state have rejected any compromise and accused those of suggesting it as being complicit in genocide. All throughout the history of war, concessions have been made
You're using tweets from like
as being complicit in
21st century. Yeah. It's a shame you're blocking the tweet. It's kind of sad. It's kind of sad that you're blowing like the tweets.
in genocide. All throughout the history of war, concessions have been made by the bested side to the victors for the sake of maintaining
Yeah, I don't think that there. I don't think that like the. I don't think that Abba Kovner did concessions with like the fucking SS. I'm just saying. I don't think. Yeah, I don't think. I don't think the Red Partisans. I mean, maybe I might be wrong on the Red Partisans, but I don't think the Red Partisans went to see like. Went to see like. Yeah, went to see like German high command, and get concessions. Same. I don't think that like. Same. I don't think the Hutu and the Tutsi like. Yeah, I don't think the Tutsis in Rwanda went to see the Hutu nationalists for concessions.
power and control of whatever territory they can. See the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of
Wait, hold on. Why are you bringing up the Treaty of Versailles? You know that the Treaty of Versailles is the thing that gave us like National Socialism to begin with, right? Because the Treaty of Versailles was so unfair towards the Germans. I mean, I'm just saying. Even like modern day historians right now say, yeah, Treaty of Versailles was kind of hard towards like Germany, and the Treaty of Riga, the Treaty of Riga like basically BTFO like Russia and Belarus. So why are you using that as an example? Where Ukrainians and Belarusians, I don't think are gonna be like very happy with the Treaty of Riga.
Riga or the Treaty of Paris for more.
And yeah, not to mention like even the Treaty of Paris, I believe like the Treaty of Paris, and I mean the whole like treaties of Versailles and the whole treaties that followed Versailles, basically like BTFO a lot of like concessions. The Treaty of Versailles led to like other treaties from like Entente powers to basically like carve up like say the Arab world, which basically kind of put the Arab world into like European colonialism, and also BTFO like a potential Assyrian and Kurdish state too after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So why are you giving like concessions to like these treaties that were completely like made by made by like super petty like states at that point because they had interest in, after the war and so.
Just that conceding land amounts to genocide is not only willful manipulation.
Well, if the Ukrainians will see conceding these lands as genocide, yeah, it's not untrue because look at what they're doing right now. They're taking Ukrainian children and saying, no, no, you will not identify as Ukrainian anymore. You will become like a full-fledged Russian. So they're not even willing to have like a Ukrainian community on their soil. It's insane. That's how bad it is. So yeah.
But it is horribly irresponsible in the age of nuclear capabilities. The best weapons and all the money.
I mean, it's true that the idea of nuclear war is super scary, but do I think that it will abide to nuclear war? I don't think so, because that'd be like real mutual assured destruction. Like yeah, and not to mention like it's so funny because who's the one who's actually like constantly like saying, hey, look out, if you do this I'm gonna push the red button, you know. Yeah, it's Putin that constantly like uses like the threat of nuclear war and so on, and yeah, each time he doesn't do it. So it's a horrible bluff, don't get me wrong, it's a horrible bluff too because it's a scary thought.
Will not win Ukraine the war. The US spent 2.3 trillion.
Why not just kicking out the Russians out of Ukrainian land and then we can talk? I'm just saying. I'm just saying because again, the Russians don't see Ukraine as like a real nation state. They don't see it as a real state. They don't see it as a real thing. So how can you negotiate with these people?
Trillion on the war in Afghanistan, only to relinquish power back to the Taliban. Additionally, the act.
They didn't. I mean, the U.S. didn't exactly relinquish power to the Taliban. they literally like were giving like yeah, because they armed and trained like the Afghan Republican military. It's actually the Afghans that didn't really give much of a fight and just said, yeah, you know what? Okay, we're just gonna lay down our weapons and what happens happens. The U.S. however is not very happy that Afghanistan is under the Taliban. I'm not defending the U.S. or anything, but I'm not defending the U.S. or anything. But to say here and say, oh well, they relinquished power to the Taliban. They were hoping that there was gonna be like a somewhat of like a defense position on the Afghan Republic side to defend off against the Taliban.
Actions of the Ukrainian government have drawn the country to be even more divided. Now is the time we need to stand up to our leaders.
Ukrainians are pretty much united right now to kick out the Russian invader. I'm just saying.
And Ukrainian nationalists to advocate for a signing of peace so that Ukraine and the rest of the world can live another day.
Yeah, that's nice, but I mean, again, how do you do peace with someone who doesn't want your state to exist, basically? Who doesn't want your people to exist? Who doesn't want like any formation? Yeah, and even like and basically just like doing this on like complete bullshit claims too. Like how do you negotiate with this guy? How do you negotiate with these people? Like it's like saying, hey, Palestinians, you need to like swallow your pride and just like give up land to like the Israeli settlers and stuff. I don't think that's gonna be like very very popular. And basically, yeah, if that happens, you're just gonna have like revanchist movements. You'll just have like a yeah, you're just gonna give like the leeway, more leeway to like the nationalists that you don't like. So you're kind of like digging your own grave here.
As always, fuck NATO.
Man, that was painful. Man, that was painful. That was painful. Well, I did what I had to do. I did I did the complicated task, right? Man, almost a 3 hour stream. Man. Well, I hope I hope for the future for the people who watch the stream in the future, um I hope you kind of yeah, I hope people like learn something from this and stuff. And yeah, if MLs are going to respond to the stream, I cannot wait to like watch their reaction to this. So anywho, for the ones who are still here, thank you for watching this. Thank you for contributing to the chat too. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye and have a good night for everybody, or a good day or a good morning, wherever in the world you are. Have a good day.